Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I'm not sure if I'll ever fully understand what happened during that winter at the old cabin in the Rockies. It's been 3 years since our visit, and I still wake up some nights with my heart pounding, the vivid details of those 5 days rushing back to me like a flood breaking through a dam. It began innocently enough. My wife, Melanie's father, Harold, was getting too old to make the drive up to the family cabin that had been in their possession for nearly 60 years. The place needed checking on, ensuring pipes hadn't burst, that the roof was holding up, that woodland creatures hadn't made a home of it. "It's just for a long weekend," Melanie had said, her eyes bright with nostalgia. "The kids will love it. Remember how Ben used to talk about wanting to learn survival skills? Our children, Ben, 14, Lily, 11, and Noah, 7, had never been to the cabin before. They'd heard stories from their mother about summers spent swimming in the nearby lake and winters huddled around the old stone fireplace. The prospect of adventure excited them, especially after months cooped up in suburban Denver. I had my reservations. January wasn't ideal for a mountain excursion, especially with young children. The weather reports had mentioned potential snowfall, though nothing severe. Still, I couldn't ignore the way Melanie's face lit up when she talked about returning to her childhood haven. It had been years since I'd seen that particular sparkle in her eyes. "We'll pack extra supplies," I assured her, already mentally preparing a list of emergency items. "And we'll keep an eye on the weather updates. If it looks bad, we'll head back early." So it was decided. We would spend Thursday through Sunday at the cabin, just long enough to check on things and give the kids a taste of mountain life. I requested Friday off work, packed our SUV with enough supplies to last a week, better safe than sorry, and we set off early Thursday morning. The first 2 hours of the drive were pleasant. The kids sat in the back, Noah clutching his favorite teddy bear, Lily reading a mystery novel, Ben alternating between his handheld game and staring out the window. Melanie played DJ, filling the car with songs from her teen years, occasionally pointing out landmarks. "There's the gas station, where Dad always stopped for beef jerky," she'd say. "Or just past that ridge is where I saw my first wild deer." As we climbed higher into the mountains, the radio began to crackle with interference. The sky, which had been a crisp winter blue, gradually darkened to a threatening grey. The first few snowflakes were greeted with excitement by the kids, but my knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as they multiplied. "Weather app says it's just a light system passing through," Melanie said, though I caught the edge of concern in her voice as she checked her phone. By the time we reached the turnoff to the private road leading to the cabin, visibility had decreased significantly. Snow swirled around us in thickening clouds, the wind howling against the car like a living entity. I shifted into four-wheel drive, creeping along at barely 15 miles per hour. "You okay, Dad?" Ben asked from the back seat, sensing my tension. "Fine, buddy. Just concentrating on the road." I forced a reassuring smile into the rearview mirror. "We're almost there." The cabin finally came into view through the curtain of white, a sturdy structure of dark wood and stone, nestled among towering pines that swayed dangerously in the wind. It wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, a loft, a combined kitchen and living area, but it had always seemed cozy in Melanie's stories. Now, with snow piling against its windows and shadows gathering in its corners, it looked different, unwelcoming somehow. I pulled as close to the front steps as I could, then turned to the family. "Okay, team, let's make this quick. I'll grab the essentials first, then come back for the rest. Melanie, can you get the kids inside and start the furnace?" We made a dash for it, the bitter cold slicing through our clothes despite our layers. The wind seemed to target us specifically, hurling snow into our faces, trying to push us back toward the car. Noah started crying when he slipped on the icy steps, but Ben helped him up. The key stuck in the lock at first, frozen perhaps. When it finally turned, the door swung open with unexpected force, as if someone inside had pulled it. The interior was dark and bitingly cold, with a musty smell that spoke of long abandonment. "It wasn't supposed to be this bad," Melanie whispered, hugging Noah close. "Dad said he had someone check on it in November." I flipped light switches, relieved when they worked. The electricity was still on, at least. "Let's get the heat going. Ben, help me bring in the supplies. Lily, stay with your mom and Noah." Over the next hour, we transformed the lifeless cabin into something approaching habitable. The old furnace groaned to life, gradually pushing back the cold. We unpacked food, bedding, games, and emergency supplies. The kids claimed the loft, excited about the adventure despite the worsening storm outside. It was while I was checking the windows for drafts that I noticed the first truly odd thing. A large wooden cross had always hung above the fireplace. Melanie had mentioned it specifically when describing the cabin's interior. Now, instead of the cross, there was only a darkened patch on the wall, as if something had burned there. "Mel," I called, keeping my voice casual. "Wasn't there supposed to be a cross above the fireplace?" She came over, frowning. "Yes, Dad's had that there forever. He's really religious about it, no pun intended. It was his father's." Her fingers reached up to touch the discolored spot on the wall. "That's strange. And look at this mark. It doesn't look like it fell. It looks like it was burned," I suggested, then immediately regretted it when I saw her face pale. "Maybe Dad took it home," she said finally, but I could tell she didn't believe it. Her father would never remove that cross. It was too important to him. I let it go, not wanting to worry her further. But as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of what looked like tiny scratches in the wood paneling around where the cross had been. They were faint, almost invisible unless the light hit them at the right angle, but they were definitely there, like something had clawed at the wall around the cross. That night, we ate canned soup heated on the old stove, played board games by lamplight, and tried to ignore the increasing ferocity of the storm outside. The wind found every crack in the cabin's aging structure, creating an eerie symphony of moans and whispers. The children, initially excited by the rustic experience, grew quieter as the evening progressed. "When is the storm going to stop?" Lily asked, peering anxiously at the windows, which had become opaque with frost and driving snow. "Probably by morning," I said, with more confidence than I felt. The weather report on my phone, when I could get reception, showed the system intensifying rather than dissipating. We might be here longer than planned. We sent the kids up to the loft around 9, Melanie and I taking the main bedroom. Even with the furnace working, the cabin retained a bone-deep chill that no amount of blankets seemed to dispel. I lay awake long after Melanie's breathing had become slow and regular, listening to the storm and trying to convince myself that the occasional thumps against the exterior walls were just branches. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it, a different sound cutting through the constant backdrop of wind. A rhythmic, deliberate knocking. 3 slow taps, then silence. 3 more taps, silence again. It wasn't random like a branch would be. It sounded intentional. I eased out of bed, careful not to wake Melanie. Grabbing my flashlight and pulling on my boots and coat, I moved quietly through the main room. The knocking continued, now coming from what seemed to be the back of the cabin. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The second I opened the back door, the full force of the storm hit me like a physical blow. Snow was falling so heavily I could barely see 3 feet ahead. The wind cut through my coat as if it were made of paper. I swept my flashlight beam across the back porch, expecting to see a tree branch, or perhaps even an animal seeking shelter. What I saw instead made my blood turn as cold as the air around me. Deep gouges marked the wooden railing of the porch, fresh enough that small splinters still clung to the edges. They weren't random. They formed a pattern of 3 parallel lines, repeated at intervals along the railing. They looked like claw marks, but larger than any animal I knew inhabited these mountains. As I stood there, flashlight beam trembling on those marks, I heard a low sound from somewhere beyond the porch. It wasn't quite a growl, not exactly a moan, but something in between, a sound no human throat could make. And it was answered from the opposite direction by another identical sound. I retreated inside, securing the door with shaking hands. Logic told me there were explanations, territorial animals, the acoustics of the storm playing tricks, my own imagination heightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. But something deeper, more primitive in me, recognized a warning when I heard one. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. I lay rigid beside Melanie, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every howl of the wind, and occasionally, just at the edge of hearing, the three-tap knocking would return, moving around the perimeter of the cabin as if something was testing for weaknesses, searching for a way in. Morning arrived with deceptive brightness. The storm had temporarily subsided, though dark clouds on the horizon promised more to come. I hadn't mentioned the night's disturbances to anyone, telling myself I'd confirm my suspicions before alarming the family. After breakfast, I made an excuse to check the exterior of the cabin. In the harsh light of day, I expected the claw marks to look less sinister, perhaps revealed as nothing more than old damage from weather or wildlife. Instead, they appeared even more disturbing. The gouges were deep, wood splintered outward, as if struck with tremendous force. And now I could see that similar marks appeared at intervals around the entire cabin, as if something had circled it repeatedly. I took photos with my phone, then noticed something else, footprints in the fresh snow, circling the cabin just as the marks did. But they weren't animal tracks, nor were they human exactly. They were too large, oddly spaced, and had an unusual configuration. 5 toe-like impressions splayed wide, with what looked like claw points extending beyond them. "Thomas?" Melanie's voice startled me so badly I nearly dropped my phone. She stood in the doorway, hugging herself against the cold. "What are you doing out here?" I hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "Just checking for storm damage. Looks like something got at the railings." She came closer, examining the gouges. "Bears? I didn't think they'd be active this time of year." "No, not bears," I said, then quickly added, "probably just some damage that's been here a while." Hard to tell with the weathering. I deliberately positioned myself to block her view of the footprints, using my own boots to obscure them. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, studying my face. "You look terrible. Just restless. New place, you know." I forced a smile. "How are the kids?" "Excited about the snow." Noah's been begging to build a snowman since he woke up. I glanced at the sky. "We've probably got a few hours before the next wave hits. Maybe we should let them play outside while they can." The morning passed with forced normalcy. I helped the children build not just a snowman, but an entire snow family. Melanie took photos, laughing as Lily and Noah engaged in a snowball fight. Ben, always more observant than the others, occasionally cast questioning glances my way, as if sensing my unease. "Dad, what made those marks on the porch?" he asked during a quiet moment when his siblings were distracted. I shouldn't have been surprised by his perception. Probably just old damage. I repeated my lie from earlier. "This place has been here a long time. They look fresh," he persisted. "And they're everywhere." I counted them, always in sets of 3. Children notice patterns adults might miss. I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Just some animal, Ben. Nothing to worry about." His eyes, so much like mine, held doubt. "I heard noises last night, like something was walking around outside." The storm was pretty bad. Lots of branches falling, wind playing tricks. He nodded slowly, accepting my explanation without believing it. "If you say so, Dad." By noon, the storm clouds had rolled in again, forcing us back inside. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the wind resumed its assault on the cabin. I checked my phone. No service. The weather app's last update showed the storm intensifying over the next 24 hours. "We might need to stay an extra day," I told Melanie quietly, while the kids arranged a board game on the coffee table. Roads could be impassable by tomorrow. She nodded, resignation in her eyes. I packed extra food just in case. We'll be okay. That afternoon, as daylight began to fade alarmingly early, I noticed the second, truly unsettling thing about the cabin. Family photos that Melanie had mentioned, ones that should have been hanging in the hallway near the bedrooms, were missing. Not just taken down, but the walls showed no evidence they had ever been there at all. "Mel," I called, keeping my voice low. "Weren't there supposed to be family photos along this wall?" She frowned, running her hand over the empty wall. "Yes, Dad's wedding photo, grandparents, the 4 generations picture." Her voice trailed off. "I don't understand. He would never take those down. Could someone else have been here? A maintenance person or something?" She shook her head slowly. "Dad would have told me. And why would anyone remove photos? It doesn't make sense." I didn't have an answer for her. Nothing about this place was making sense anymore. As darkness fell completely, the cabin seemed to shrink around us, the shadows in the corners deepening despite the lamps we'd lit. The old furnace labored against the dropping temperature, occasionally making alarming clanking sounds that made us all jump. We ate a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce, trying to maintain conversation despite the increasing tension. Noah kept looking over his shoulder toward the darkened hallway. Lily stayed unusually close to her mother. Even Ben, normally stoic, startled at every unexpected noise. It was just after 8 when the scratching began. At first, it was so faint I thought I might be imagining it. A light scraping sound coming from inside the walls. But when I saw Noah's eyes widen, I knew he heard it too. "What's that?" he whispered, fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "Probably just mice," Melanie said quickly. "Old cabins like this often have mice." The scratching continued, moving slowly from one wall to another, as if something was traveling through the space between the interior and exterior walls. It wasn't random scrambling like rodents would make. It was methodical, deliberate. 3 scratches, pause. 3 more, exactly like the knocking from the previous night. "Those aren't mice," Ben said flatly. "It's just the wind making the house settle," I countered. But even to my own ears, the explanation sounded hollow. The scratching grew louder, now accompanied by a faint whispering sound that might have been wind through cracks, except that it almost formed words, just below the threshold of comprehension. Noah began to cry silently, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the wall where the sounds were most concentrated. "Hey, how about a game?" I suggested with forced brightness. "Or we could read one of the books we brought." "I want to go home," Lily said, her voice small but determined. "I don't like it here." "We can't drive in this weather, sweetheart," Melanie explained gently. "It's not safe. But we'll leave as soon as we can, I promise." I stood up, needing to do something, anything. "I'm going to check the furnace. It's getting cold in here." The old furnace occupied a small closet near the kitchen. I opened the door, shining my flashlight inside. The pilot light was still burning, the mechanism humming as it should. But as I leaned in closer, I noticed something scratched into the metal side of the furnace. The same 3 parallel lines I'd seen on the porch railing. But these looked older, oxidized with time. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Whatever was happening here wasn't new. It had happened before. When I returned to the main room, the scratching had stopped. The sudden silence felt almost worse than the noise had been. The children looked shell-shocked, huddled together on the couch. "Everything's fine with the furnace," I announced, summoning every ounce of fatherly reassurance I could muster. "Now who wants hot chocolate before bed?" That night, none of us suggested the children sleep in the loft. Without discussion, we all gathered in the main bedroom. Melanie and I in the bed, the children in sleeping bags on the floor. I kept a heavy flashlight beside me, both for light and as a potential weapon, though against what? I couldn't say. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the continuing storm and occasional sounds that couldn't be explained by wind or settling timber. Twice I woke to find Noah standing beside the bed, staring at the bedroom door with wide, terrified eyes. "Something's out there," he whispered the second time, his small body trembling. "I can hear it breathing." I listened intently, but heard nothing beyond the storm. "It's just the wind, buddy," I said, lifting him onto the bed between Melanie and me. "Try to sleep." But as he drifted off, I remained awake, watching the thin line of darkness under the door. And just when I had almost convinced myself it was indeed my imagination, I saw it, a shadow passing by outside the room, momentarily blocking the faint light from the living area. Something was moving through the cabin. The next morning, we awoke to a cabin transformed. The temperature had plummeted overnight, our breath visible in the bedroom, despite the furnace's constant operation. Frost patterns decorated the insides of the windows, intricate whirls and spirals that seemed too organized to be natural. Most disturbing of all, the main room had been rearranged. The furniture was all slightly out of position, moved a few inches from where we'd left it. Items we'd placed on tables, books, games, flashlights, had been organized into precise patterns, 3 items in a triangle, another 3 beside them, and so on. "Did one of you kids get up during the night?" Melanie asked, her voice tight with controlled fear. 3 heads shook in denial. The children looked as bewildered as we were. "Maybe it was sleepwalking," I suggested weakly. "Stress can trigger that." No one believed me, not even myself. Checking my phone, I found we still had no service. The storm continued unabated outside. Snow now piled halfway up the windows. Even if we wanted to leave, it would be nearly impossible without snowshoes or skis, neither of which we had brought. We were trapped, at least for another day. Breakfast was a silent affair, everyone jumping at the smallest sounds. The scratching had resumed inside the walls, now accompanied by occasional thumps that vibrated through the floor. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, discussing plans for the day, as if we were simply dealing with bad weather rather than whatever this was. "The bookshelf in the hallway has some old board games," Melanie said, attempting to match my pretense. "We could try those." Ben gave her a look that seemed far too old for his 14 years. "Mom, something's wrong with this place. We need to leave." "We will as soon as—" My response was cut short by a sudden violent bang from the back of the cabin, as if something had struck the exterior wall with tremendous force. Noah screamed. Lily dropped her fork with a clatter. Before I could react, 3 more bangs followed in rapid succession, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Something was circling us again, this time making no attempt at subtlety. I moved to the nearest window, wiping away the frost to peer outside. The storm created a white curtain that obscured everything beyond a few feet, but as I watched, a dark shape moved through the swirling snow. Tall, vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow in its proportions. It passed out of view before I could make out details. "Thomas?" Melanie's voice was barely audible over the renewed pounding, which now seemed to come from all sides simultaneously. "Stay away from the windows," I ordered, moving back to the table. "Everyone, stay together." The banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by Noah's quiet sobbing and the howl of the wind. We remained frozen at the breakfast table, waiting for something more to happen. When it came, it was worse than the noise. A low vibration began in the floor beneath us, gradually intensifying until the dishes rattled on the table. The temperature dropped further, our exhalations creating thick clouds in the air. And then, from everywhere and nowhere at once, came a sound that defied description. Part growl, part moan, but with an undercurrent of something almost like words, spoken in a language that predated human speech. Ben was the first to break, bolting from his chair toward the front door. "We have to get out of here." I caught him before he could reach the handle. "No, we can't go out in the storm. We'd freeze to death before reaching the car. We'll die in here," he shouted, struggling against my grip. The vibration increased, items beginning to fall from shelves. A glass shattered on the floor. Noah's wailing grew louder, matched by Lily's terrified whimpers. Melanie stood paralyzed, her face drained of color. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything stopped. The cabin settled back into silence, though the temperature remained unnaturally low. We stayed clustered together, waiting for the next assault. It didn't come. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Gradually, we allowed ourselves to move again, though no one ventured alone into any part of the cabin. We spent the day in the main room, keeping the fire stoked high, speaking little. The children remained subdued, jumping at every creak of the structure. I tried repeatedly to get a signal on my phone, even climbing onto furniture to hold it higher. But the storm or something else blocked all communication. We were utterly isolated. By late afternoon, I had made a decision. If the storm breaks at all, even briefly, we're making a run for the car. We'll drive down the mountain, whatever the conditions. Melanie nodded, no longer arguing for staying. We'll need to pack quickly, just essentials. I want my teddy, Noah whispered, his first words in hours. Of course, buddy. We'll make sure to grab him, I assured him, ruffling his hair. We began subtle preparations, gathering essential items and placing them near the door, ready for a rapid departure. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but I clung to hope that there would be a break, some window of opportunity. As dusk approached, bringing with it a darkness that seemed too complete for the hour, we heated canned stew for dinner. No one had much appetite, but I insisted everyone eat something to maintain strength. We would need it if we had to wade through deep snow to reach the car. It was during this forced meal that Lily suddenly stiffened, her eyes fixed on a point over my shoulder. "Dad," she said, her voice barely audible. "There's someone in the hallway." I turned slowly, following her gaze. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, the shadows seeming to flow and shift like liquid. At first, I saw nothing but blackness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I discerned a figure standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight, a tall, unnaturally thin silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It didn't move. It made no sound. It simply watched. "Everyone stay calm," I said quietly, though my own heart was hammering against my ribs. "Don't make any sudden movements. What is it?" Ben asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I admitted. There was no point in fabricating explanations anymore. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a movement too fluid to be human, it retreated deeper into the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. "It's gone," Melanie whispered, though none of us felt any relief. "We're sleeping in shifts tonight," I announced. "I'll take first watch. Mel, you and the kids try to rest." "I'll stay up with you," Ben volunteered, his face pale but determined. I wanted to refuse, to protect him from whatever was happening. But the truth was, I didn't want to be alone. "Okay, but you wake me immediately if you get too tired." As Melanie settled with the younger children on the pull-out couch in the main room, Ben and I positioned ourselves near the fire, backs to the wall, facing both the hallway and the front door. I had my flashlight and a fire poker within reach. Ben clutched a heavy book, the only weapon he could find. "Dad," he said after a long silence, his voice low so as not to disturb the others. "What is happening here?" I considered lying, offering some rational explanation that neither of us would believe. Instead, I opted for honesty. "I don't know, Ben, but whatever it is, we're getting out tomorrow. I promise." He nodded, accepting this. After another pause, he asked, "Do you believe in, evil? Not just bad people, but something else?" The question hung between us, heavier than it might have been in normal circumstances. "I've never had reason to," I said finally. "But this place," I gestured vaguely at the cabin around us, "something isn't right here." "I feel like it's watching us all the time," he whispered, "even when we can't see it. Like it's waiting for something." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Try not to think about it. Focus on getting through the night." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Occasionally, we would hear the now familiar scratching in the walls or 3-tap knocking from various points around the cabin. Twice more, I glimpsed the tall shadow figure moving at the periphery of my vision, but it never approached directly. Around 2 a.m., Ben finally succumbed to exhaustion, his head nodding forward despite his best efforts. I covered him with a blanket, letting him sleep while I maintained vigil alone. In that deepest part of night, with the storm still raging outside and my family asleep around me, a terrible clarity came to me. Whatever presence inhabited this cabin wasn't just trying to frighten us. It was feeding on our fear, growing stronger with each manifestation, each reaction it provoked from us. The realization brought no comfort, only a deepening dread. I must have dozed off briefly, despite my determination to stay awake. I was jolted back to consciousness by Noah's piercing scream. He stood in the center of the room, pointing toward the kitchen area, his face contorted in terror. It was right there. It touched me. I rushed to him, gathering his trembling body in my arms. "It's okay, you're safe. I've got you." No, it was here. It had long fingers and no face, and it touched my hair. His hysteria was building, threatening to trigger panic in Lily, who was now awake and wide-eyed. "Shh, it was just a bad dream," I soothed, though I knew it likely wasn't. "Look, there's nothing there now." But as I gazed toward the kitchen, I saw it. 3 wet marks on the floor, as if something with dripping fingers had walked through. They were already evaporating, but undeniably present. Melanie saw them too, her face hardening with maternal protectiveness. "That's it. We're leaving at first light, storm or no storm." No one argued. We spent the remaining hours until dawn, huddled together, fully dressed and ready to depart, bags packed by the door. The cabin grew increasingly hostile around us, temperature fluctuating wildly, unidentifiable odors permeating the air. The physical structure itself seeming to shift and settle in ways that defied architectural possibility. When the first grey light of morning finally penetrated the frost-covered windows, we didn't wait for full daylight. We gathered our bags, opened the door, and stepped out into the still falling snow. The storm had transformed the landscape into an alien terrain of white drifts and ice-coated trees. The wind still blew, though with less violence than the previous day. Snow had accumulated to nearly 3 feet in places, with deeper drifts against the cabin walls. Our SUV was barely visible, just a snow-covered mound where we had parked it. The path to it, though only about 20 feet, looked formidable for the younger children to navigate. "I'll carry Noah," I said, hoisting him onto my hip despite his size. "Ben, help your sister. Mel, can you manage the essential bags?" She nodded grimly, shouldering our emergency pack. "Let's move." The journey to the car was more difficult than anticipated. The snow reached mid-thigh in places, each step requiring significant effort. Halfway there I heard Noah gasp, his body tensing against mine. "Dad," he whispered into my ear, "it's watching us from the window." I didn't turn around, didn't give whatever it was the satisfaction of acknowledgement. "Keep looking forward, buddy. We're almost at the car." When we reached the vehicle, I set Noah down to begin clearing snow from the doors and windows. The cold bit through my gloves, numbing my fingers as I worked. The others huddled close, their breath creating a cloud around us. "Hurry, Dad," Lily urged, her eyes repeatedly darting back toward the cabin. "I'm working as fast as I can, sweetheart." The ice had formed a thick crust over everything, requiring more than just brushing away. I used the edge of a credit card to scrape at the driver's side lock, finally clearing it enough to insert the key. As the door unlocked with a reassuring click, a loud crack came from behind us, the sound of the cabin's front door slamming open with tremendous force. All of us turned instinctively. The doorway stood empty, a black void in contrast to the white surroundings. But the porch was marked with fresh tracks, the same strange 5-toed impressions I had seen before, now leading from the door toward us. "Get in the car," I ordered, my voice leaving no room for question. "Now!" We scrambled inside, the children practically diving into the back seat. I inserted the key with shaking hands, silently pleading with the engine to start, despite the cold. For one heart-stopping moment it only clicked weakly. Then, with a roar that sounded like salvation, it turned over. "Thank God," Melanie breathed beside me. The windshield was still mostly covered with snow and ice, offering only a small cleared portion to see through. I blasted the defroster, then put the vehicle in reverse, relying more on memory than visibility to back away from the cabin. As we began to move, something hit the roof of the car with enough force to dent the metal inward. Noah and Lily screamed. Ben positioned between them, threw his arms around his siblings protectively. "Don't stop." Melanie shouted as I instinctively braked at the impact. I pressed the accelerator again, the SUV fishtailing slightly on the unplowed snow. Another impact, this time against the driver's side window, leaving a web of cracks across the glass. I caught a glimpse of something, a limb or appendage, unnaturally long and jointed, before it withdrew. We reached the turn onto the main access road, the car sliding dangerously as I navigated the curve. The private lane to the cabin disappeared behind us, swallowed by trees and swirling snow. Relief began to build in my chest. We were away from the immediate vicinity of the cabin. That relief was short-lived. After less than a quarter mile, the engine began to sputter. The dashboard lights flickered, then went out completely. The car rolled to a stop, momentum lost. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key repeatedly. Nothing happened. No click, no indicator lights, as if all electrical systems had been completely drained. "What's happening?" Melanie asked, panic edging her voice. "I don't know. Everything's dead." I slammed my palm against the steering wheel in frustration. "It was fine a minute ago." "Can we walk?" Ben asked from the back seat. I looked out at the snowy expanse stretching before us. The main road was at least 2 miles away, through deep snow and dropping temperatures. With young children it would be dangerous at best, deadly at worst. We'd never make it, not all of us, I said grimly. "We need to get the car working." I popped the hood and stepped out into the snow, the cold immediately attacking any exposed skin. The engine compartment looked normal, no obvious damage or disconnected components. It made no sense for a modern vehicle to simply die like this. As I stood there, frustration mounting, I became aware of a sound behind me, soft crunching in the snow, like footsteps approaching. I turned slowly, expecting to see Melanie or Ben coming to help. Instead, I saw only our tracks leading back toward the cabin. But between me and the car, a new set of impressions was forming in the pristine snow. Those same 5-toed prints, appearing one after another, as if an invisible entity was walking toward me. My body froze in primal terror. The footprints stopped about 6 feet away from me. Though I could see nothing, I felt a presence there, a concentration of malevolence that pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. "Leave us alone," I whispered, the words emerging as white vapor that hung in the frigid air between us. "We're leaving. We won't come back." The invisible presence remained motionless for several heartbeats. Then, without warning, the snow between us erupted upward as if something had lunged. I stumbled backward, falling against the front of the car. From inside, I heard Melanie scream my name. The driver's door flew open and Ben emerged, brandishing a tire iron he must have found under the seat. "Dad, get in," he shouted, his young face set with determination that broke my heart. Whatever had approached me seemed to hesitate at this new development. The disturbed snow settled, no new footprints appearing. I scrambled to my feet, slamming the hood closed. "Get back in the car, Ben," I ordered, moving toward him. "Now!" He retreated, keeping the tire iron raised. As soon as we were both inside, I locked all doors, though I doubted they would provide real protection against whatever was out there. "It followed us," Lily said, her voice small and broken. "It's never going to let us go." "Yes, it will," I insisted, trying once more to start the engine. Nothing happened. "We just need to think." Melanie pulled out her phone. Still no signal. "We're on our own." I stared through the cracked windshield at the empty road ahead, mind racing through options, each worse than the last. We couldn't stay in the car indefinitely. Without heat, the temperature inside would soon match the deadly cold outside. We couldn't walk out, not all of us. and returning to the cabin was unthinkable. Then Noah spoke up, his voice surprisingly steady. "Grandpa's old truck." I turned to look at him. "What?" "Grandpa's old truck," he repeated. "Mom showed me a picture. She said it's in the shed behind the cabin." Melanie's eyes widened. "The storage shed." "Dad keeps his old Ford there for emergencies." I completely forgot about it. Hope flickered weakly in my chest. Would it still run? "How long has it been sitting there?" "Dad maintains it religiously. Changes the oil twice a year, keeps it winterized." She gripped my arm. "It might be our only chance." The thought of returning to the cabin's vicinity made my stomach clench. But she was right, it was our best option. If the truck would start, we might still escape. "Okay," I said finally. "We go back, but we stay together. No one separates for any reason. We go straight to the shed, get the truck, and leave immediately." "Understood?" Everyone nodded, faces grim but resolute. "What about that thing?" Ben asked, still clutching the tire iron. "We don't acknowledge it. We don't speak to it. We focus only on what we're doing." I wasn't sure if this strategy would work, but instinct told me that giving the entity attention only strengthened it. We prepared as best we could, redistributing essential supplies into the fewest bags possible. I kept the car keys, though they seemed useless now. Melanie helped the younger children secure their coats and gloves. "Ready?" I asked, my hand on the door handle. 4 pale faces nodded back at me. The return journey was arduous. We followed our own tracks, which were already beginning to fill with fresh snow. I carried Noah again, while Ben helped Lily through the deepest drifts. Melanie brought up the rear, constantly scanning behind us. As we approached the cabin, it seemed to loom larger than before, as if it had somehow grown during our absence. No lights showed in the windows, though we had left several on. The front door remained open, just as we had seen it last, a black rectangle against the weathered wood. "The shed is around back," Melanie said, pointing to our right. "We don't need to go near the house." We circled wide around the cabin, keeping as much distance as possible. Though nothing visible pursued us, I could feel a tension on us, a hungry, patient observation that made the hairs on my neck stand rigid. The storage shed was a simple structure, about 20 feet behind the main cabin. Its door was secured with a padlock, crusted with ice. "The key?" I asked Melanie. "Dad keeps it," her voice faltered. "He keeps it inside the cabin. On a hook in the kitchen." The knowledge hit us like a physical blow. To access the shed, someone would have to enter the cabin again, the place that had made its malevolent intentions abundantly clear. "I'll go," I said immediately. "No." Melanie's expression was resolute. "It's my father's cabin. I know exactly where the key is." "I'll be faster." "Mom, no!" Lily clung to her mother's coat. "It's okay, sweetie. I'll be in and out in 30 seconds. Melanie knelt, looking each child in the eyes. "Stay with your father. Do exactly what he says." Before I could object further, she pressed a quick kiss to my lips and turned toward the cabin. 30 seconds, she repeated, then began trudging through the snow. We watched in agonizing silence as she approached the open door. She paused briefly on the threshold, then disappeared inside. Seconds stretched like hours. Noah buried his face against my shoulder, then kept a protective arm around Lily, who stared fixedly at the cabin, silently counting 21, 22, 23. At 28, Melanie reappeared in the doorway, something small glinting in her raised hand. Relief flooded through me as she hurried back toward us. "Got it," she gasped upon reaching us, her breath ragged. It was right where it should be. If she had seen anything inside, she didn't mention it. Her hands trembled as she worked to unlock the padlock, ice cracking around the keyhole as she turned it. The shed door swung open with a groan of frozen hinges, revealing the hulking shape of an old Ford pickup truck covered with a tarp. Ben and I quickly pulled the covering away, while Melanie ushered the younger children inside the relative shelter of the shed. The truck was ancient, probably from the 1970s, but appeared well maintained. Its dark blue paint was faded but intact, no significant rust visible. "Keys?" I asked. "Ignition," Melanie replied. "Dad always leaves them there." I opened the driver's door, relieved to find she was right. The interior was dusty but clean, the vinyl seats cracked with age, but functional. I turned the key, holding my breath. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with surprising vigor. Exhaust billowed from the tailpipe, quickly filling the small shed with fumes. "Everyone in," I shouted over the engine noise. "Hurry!" The truck had a bench seat, wide enough for all of us to squeeze onto. Ben helped the younger children climb in, then Melanie, with me taking the driver's position. The ancient heater whirred to life, though it would be some time before it produced actual warmth. I shifted into reverse, carefully backing out of the shed. The truck's tires were proper snow tires, with chains already attached. Harold had indeed prepared it for emergency winter use. As we cleared the shed, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Something dark and fluid slipping around the corner of the cabin, moving with unnatural speed. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the truck fishtailing slightly before finding traction. "Don't look back," I said loudly, though I wasn't sure if I was addressing my family or myself. "Just keep looking forward." The truck performed admirably in the deep snow, its weight and chains providing stability our modern SUV had lacked. We passed our abandoned vehicle without stopping, continuing toward the main road. When we finally reached the paved road, I allowed myself a moment of hope. We were away from the cabin in a functioning vehicle, headed down the mountain. Perhaps the entity's influence was limited to the property itself. That hope was short-lived. But 5 miles down the mountain road, the truck's radio suddenly sparked to life, though no one had touched it. Static filled the cab, punctuated by bursts of what sounded like whispering voices, speaking too quickly to comprehend. Noah began to cry again. Melanie reached across to shut off the radio, but it continued broadcasting, even with the knob in the off position. The static grew louder, the whispers more distinct, though still unintelligible. "Ignore it," I said firmly, increasing our speed despite the treacherous road conditions. "It's trying to distract us." The radio crackled once more, then emitted a sound that made us all flinch, 3 distinct knocks, identical to what we had heard in the cabin. The static cleared, and through the speakers came a voice that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. "Coming home soon." The radio died abruptly, leaving only the rumble of the engine and our accelerated breathing. "It knows where we live," Lily whispered, horror dawning on her face. "It knows our home address." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, refusing to give in to the fresh wave of terror. "It's just trying to scare us. Once we're off this mountain, we'll be fine." But a seed of doubt had been planted. What if the entity wasn't bound to the cabin? What if, having found us, it could follow anywhere? I pushed the truck faster than was safe, desperate to put distance between us and whatever lurked behind. The storm was beginning to ease, patches of clear sky appearing between clouds. It seemed a positive sign, as if nature itself was acknowledging our escape. We drove in tense silence for nearly an hour, gradually descending to lower elevations where snow gave way to mere wetness on the road. No one spoke of what had happened, though the children remained pressed tightly together, seeking comfort in physical contact. When we finally reached the outskirts of the nearest town, a collective exhalation seemed to pass through the truck. Civilization, even a small mountain community, felt like sanctuary after our ordeal. "We need to call your father," I said to Melanie as we passed the town's welcome sign. "He needs to know what happened." She nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. "And we're never going back there, never. Where will we go now?" Ben asked from beside her. I considered our options. We couldn't return home, not immediately. Not without knowing for certain that whatever had attached itself to us in that cabin couldn't follow. We needed neutral ground, somewhere to recover and plan. Hotel, I decided. "We'll get a room here in town for tonight, figure out the rest tomorrow." No one argued. We found a modest motel near the center of town, its vacancy sign a welcome beacon. Using the last of our emergency cash, I secured a room with 2 queen beds. As we settled into the room, the normality of it, floral bedspreads, generic landscape paintings. Television remote in plastic felt surreal after what we had experienced. The children collapsed onto one bed, their reserves of adrenaline finally depleted. Within minutes, Noah and Lily were asleep, Ben fighting to keep his eyes open, but soon joining them. Melanie and I sat on the edge of the other bed, holding hands in silence. There was too much to process, too many questions without answers. "What was it?" she finally whispered. I shook my head slowly. "I don't know. I don't think I want to know. My father, all these years he never said anything. Just that old story about my grandfather seeing something once." Her fingers tightened around mine. "How could he send us there?" "Maybe he didn't know," I suggested, though without conviction. "Maybe it doesn't happen every time. Or maybe it had never manifested so strongly before," I thought but didn't say. Maybe our presence, the children perhaps, had awakened something that usually remained dormant. "We need to warn him," Melanie said. "No one else should go there." I nodded, reaching for the room phone. It was time to call Harold and tell him exactly what had happened in his family's cabin and why no one should ever return. Harold didn't believe us, at least not at first. When we called from the motel room, he listened to our account with growing skepticism. The missing crucifix, the scratching in the walls, the dark figure. He dismissed them all as products of storm-induced stress and cabin fever. "That old place creaks and groans, always has," he said, his voice crackling over the phone line. "And the cross probably just fell and got lost. No need for ghost stories." It was only when Melanie described the specific location of the claw marks, the pattern they formed, and the whispering voice through the truck's radio that his tone changed. He grew quiet, then asked her to put me on the phone. "Thomas," he said, voice suddenly old and fragile, "did you actually see anything? Any figure or creature?" I described the shape I'd glimpsed through the storm, the footprints forming in empty snow, the shadow in the hallway with its too long proportions. His breathing became audible over the line. "My father saw it too back in '62. No one believed him either." A long pause. "I've only been there in summer for the past decade. Never in winter. Never during storms." "What is it?" I asked directly. "I don't know. Nobody does. Local indigenous people avoided that whole area long before my grandfather built there. Said the mountain had a hunger." Another pause. "I should have sold the place years ago." "You need to sell it now," I told him firmly, "or tear it down. No one should stay there again." "Yes," he agreed, surprising me with his ready acquiescence. "Yes, you're right. I'll take care of it." Then, more softly, "Are my grandchildren all right?" I looked at the 3 sleeping forms on the bed. Physically, they were unharmed. Mentally, that remained to be seen. "They're shaken up, but they'll be okay." "I'm sorry," Harold said, genuine remorse in his voice. I truly didn't think. I never imagined it would be like that. After ending the call, I joined Melanie on the bed, both of us watching our children sleep. The artificial warmth of the motel room, the distant sounds of normal human activity from neighboring rooms. These should have been reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't truly over. "He knew," Melanie said flatly. "Not everything, but he knew something was wrong with that place. And he sent us anyway." I couldn't disagree. Harold's reaction had made it clear he wasn't entirely surprised by our experience, just by its intensity. He said he'll get rid of the cabin. "Good," her voice hardened, "because I never want to see it again." We stayed in that motel for 2 nights, using some of our emergency credit to purchase fresh clothes and necessities. During the day, we tried to maintain normalcy for the children's sake, eating at the local diner, letting them swim in the motel's small indoor pool, watching innocuous television shows. At night, though, the effects of our experience revealed themselves. Noah had nightmares, waking screaming about the tall man with no face. Lily refused to be alone, even to use the bathroom. Ben became hypervigilant, checking locks repeatedly and positioning himself between the younger children and the door. On the 3rd day, we rented a car and began the drive back to Denver. Our home felt simultaneously like sanctuary and potential trap. What if the entity had meant what it said through the truck's radio? What if it could follow us here? I installed new locks, a security system. We left lights on at night. For weeks, we all slept in the master bedroom, reluctant to separate even in our own home. Gradually, though, life began to resume its rhythm. The children returned to school. Melanie and I went back to work. The acute terror faded to a background anxiety that only occasionally flared into panic. Harold kept his word. He listed the cabin for sale, disclosing its atmospheric disturbances to potential buyers. It sat on the market for months, price dropping steadily, before a development company finally purchased it along with surrounding land, intending to clear everything for a new vacation home community. We thought that would be the end of it. The cabin demolished, the entity, whatever it was, left without its long-time dwelling place. Perhaps it would dissipate, or move on to another remote location far from human habitation. We were wrong. 6 months after our escape from the cabin, the first subtle signs appeared. Items in our home would be moved slightly from their usual positions, not dramatically, just enough to notice. The house would be unusually cold in specific areas, particularly the hallway outside the children's rooms. Noah began to speak of a tall shadow he sometimes saw standing in his doorway at night. We assumed it was residual trauma, manifestations of PTSD from his experience. We took him to a child psychologist, who seemed to help initially. Then Ben found them, 3 parallel scratch marks on the underside of his desk, identical to those we had seen at the cabin. When confronted, he swore he hadn't made them, hadn't noticed them before. Melanie discovered similar marks inside our bedroom closet, hidden behind hanging clothes. I found them in the garage, freshly carved into the wooden workbench. One night I woke to the sound that had haunted my nightmares for months. 3 distinct knocks, coming from inside our bedroom wall. Beside me, Melanie stirred, her eyes opening wide with recognition and fear. "It followed us," she whispered. "It's here." I wanted to deny it, to find some rational explanation, but I knew. We both knew. The entity from the cabin had attached itself to us, or perhaps to one of us, and accompanied us home. It had been patient, biding its time, gradually making its presence known. The next morning we gathered the children in the living room for a family meeting. No more pretending, no more dismissing strange occurrences as imagination or coincidence. They deserved to know what we were facing. "We think that whatever was in the cabin might have followed us here," I said, watching their faces carefully. Noah began to cry silently. Lily grabbed her brother's hand. Ben just nodded, unsurprised. "I know," he said quietly. "I've felt it watching me for weeks. What do we do?" Lily asked, her voice small but steady. It was the question I'd been asking myself constantly. What defense did we have against something that wasn't bound by physical laws, that could apparently travel across distances, that seemed to exist partially in some other dimension? "We fight it," I said with more confidence than I felt. "We learn everything we can about it, and we find a way to make it leave." Over the following weeks, we embarked on a crash course in the paranormal, consulting experts, reading obscure texts, even visiting indigenous elders who knew the stories of the mountain where the cabin stood. Some thought we were crazy. Others listened with grave understanding, offering methods that ranged from scientific to spiritual. We tried everything: cleansing rituals, electronic detection equipment, protective symbols from various traditions. Some approaches seemed to temporarily diminish the entity's manifestations, but nothing banished it completely. The knocking continued, now moving throughout the house. The scratching inside walls became a regular occurrence, often starting at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time we realized when we had first heard it in the cabin. The children reported glimpses of the tall shadow figure with increasing frequency. Then came the whispering, soft at first, barely audible, emanating from heating vents and empty corners. Unlike at the cabin, here the whispers were distinct enough to make out occasional words. "Mine. Stay." forever. The final escalation occurred on a night exactly 1 year after our visit to the cabin. We were awakened by Noah's screams, more terrified than we had ever heard. We rushed to his room to find him pressed against his headboard, pointing at the foot of his bed where a dark, hunched figure stood motionless. Unlike previous manifestations, this wasn't a glimpse or shadow. The entity was fully visible, a tall, emaciated form with limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. Its skin was darkly mottled, its face a blank expanse with only the suggestion of features, as if they had been partially erased. 5 elongated fingers extended from hands that reached nearly to its knees. It didn't move as we entered, didn't react to our presence at all. It simply stood, watching Noah with eyeless attention. Then slowly, its head rotated toward us, a movement no human neck could accomplish, and I felt the full weight of its malevolence. In that moment, I understood what we were facing wasn't a ghost or spirit in the traditional sense. It was something older, something that had perhaps never been human, something that had existed in that mountain long before the cabin was built, using the structure as a gateway to those who entered. And now it had found a new home. "Get out!" I shouted, moving to stand between it and my son. "You're not welcome here!" For the first time, the entity reacted, a ripple passing through its form, like dark water disturbed by a stone. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, regarding me with what felt like curiosity. Then it spoke, not in whispers through vents, but directly, a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind. "This is my home now." The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost formed instantly on the windows. Noah's breath came in visible clouds as he sobbed behind me. I felt Melanie's hand clasp mine, felt her steady presence beside me as she, too, faced the thing that had invaded our lives. "No," she said, her voice remarkably composed. "This is our home, our family. You have no place here." The entity seemed to grow larger, the darkness around it deepening. The walls began to vibrate with that now familiar 3-pattern rhythm. What happened next is difficult to describe, even years later. I remember Melanie stepping forward, still holding my hand. I remember Ben appearing in the doorway, then moving to stand beside us, forming a human barrier between the entity and Noah. I remember Lily joining us, her small hand finding Ben's, completing our line. The entity advanced, its form becoming less distinct, more like a concentrated darkness. The air felt thick, resistant, as if reality itself was being distorted by its presence. And then, from somewhere deep within me, came words I hadn't planned or thought about, words that felt ancient and powerful, rising up from some ancestral memory or collective knowledge, by the strength of our bond, by the light we carry, by the love that connects us. You are cast out. You have no power here. You are not permitted. You must leave. Melanie's voice joined mine, then Ben's, then Lily's, even Noah's from behind us. Different words, perhaps, but the same intent, the same unified rejection of this invading presence. The entity writhed, its form contracting and expanding. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, the air vibrating with a subsonic frequency that made my teeth ache. For a moment I thought it would simply absorb our resistance, grow stronger from our defiance. Instead, something else happened. Where our 5 forms stood, a light began to emanate. Not physical illumination, but something more fundamental, as if the very fabric of reality was asserting itself against the entity's distortion. Our joined hands felt electric, a current passing between us that had nothing to do with actual electricity. The entity retreated, one step, then another, its form becoming increasingly unstable. The darkness swirled around it like smoke caught in a draught. And then, with a sound like air rushing to fill a vacuum, it collapsed inward and was gone. The room returned to normal temperature. The frost on the windows began to melt. The oppressive weight that had filled the air dissipated, leaving only the ordinary night. We stood frozen in our protective line, afraid to move, afraid to trust that it was truly over. Noah's small voice broke the silence. "Is it gone?" I turned to him, seeing the fear and hope battling in his eyes. "I think so, buddy. I really think so." We spent the remainder of that night together in the living room, lights blazing, talking quietly about what had happened. None of us could explain the light, the current we had felt, the words that had come so naturally, yet seemed so ancient. "It was all of us together," Ben said thoughtfully. "We were connected. That's what drove it away." Lily nodded solemnly. "We were stronger than it was." They were right, I realized. The entity had isolated us in the cabin, played on our individual fears. Here, facing it as a united family, we had accessed something it couldn't comprehend or overcome, the power of our connection to each other. In the days that followed, we remained vigilant, expecting the entity to return. But the house stayed normal. No scratching, no knocking, no whispers from empty corners. The children reported no more shadowy figures, no watching presence. Weeks passed, then months. Life gradually returned to normal, real normal, not the facade we had maintained while living under siege. Noah's nightmares subsided. Ben relaxed his hypervigilance. Lily began sleeping in her own room again. Occasionally, during storms or in the deepest part of night, I still find myself listening for that distinctive three-knock pattern. Sometimes, in unfamiliar shadows, I imagine I see a tall, distorted figure. But it never materializes, never advances. Whatever link had formed between us and the entity, whatever doorway had allowed it to follow us from the cabin to our home, seems to have been permanently closed. Harold called just after the first anniversary of our cabin trip, sounding years younger. The development company had demolished the old cabin, he told us. The land was being cleared for new construction. Strangest thing, he said. The workers found something buried underneath the foundation. Some kind of stone carving old as dirt. Nobody can figure out what it is or where it came from. I didn't ask for details. Some knowledge is better left undisturbed. We never learned exactly what the entity was or why it had fixated on our family. The indigenous elders we consulted had names for it in their languages, words that translated roughly to the hungry one or the patient watcher. They spoke of it as ancient, predating human settlement of the area, a thing that fed on fear and isolation. "It chooses," one elder told us, "waits for the right ones. Sometimes years between. You were not the first, but perhaps," he added, studying our joined hands, "you were the last." I want to believe that. I want to believe our confrontation somehow ended its existence, or at least its ability to affect our world. But sometimes, when I see reports of mysterious occurrences in remote locations, or hear of families experiencing inexplicable phenomena in their homes, I wonder, whatever dwelled in that cabin in the Colorado mountains, whatever followed us home and finally faced our unified resistance, was real. Not a ghost story, not a figment of imagination or mass hysteria. It existed in some form beyond our understanding, operated by rules we could only glimpse, and while I hope it's gone for good, I keep my family close. I maintain our bond. I remember the power we found together. Because deep down, I know there are things in this world, or perhaps beyond it, that hunger for fear, that prey on isolation, that seek to invade and possess. But I also know now that there are forces they cannot overcome. In our connection to each other, in the light we generate together, we found a power older and stronger than anything that lurked in shadows. That knowledge doesn't erase the terror of those days. It doesn't prevent the occasional nightmare or moment of irrational fear. But it provides something the entity could never understand or take from us: hope. And hope, I've learned, is the one thing that darkness can never fully extinguish. Spring arrived with a merciful absence of supernatural disturbances. The entity seemed truly gone, banished by our unified stand against it. Yet despite the return to normalcy, our home never felt quite the same. Every unexpected noise, every shadow at dusk, carried echoes of our ordeal. The children were recovering, but slowly. Noah still refused to sleep with his bedroom door closed. Lily had developed a compulsive habit of checking corners and closets. then maintained a journal documenting anything unusual he noticed, a vigilance that broke my heart, even as I understood its purpose. Melanie and I discussed our options late into many nights. Stay and reclaim our home completely? Move and start fresh elsewhere? The practical difficulties of relocating competed with the psychological weight of remaining. "I keep thinking about what that elder said," Melanie admitted during one such conversation, "about how we might have been the last family it chose. What if we're free of it, but the next family who moves in here isn't?" It was a disturbing thought. While the entity seemed attached to the cabin initially, it had demonstrated an ability to transfer its presence to our home. Could it return after we left, attaching itself to new occupants? "We don't know enough about it to be sure," I said. "But I think it's gone. Truly gone." Nevertheless, the seed was planted. When a job opportunity presented itself in Portland the following month, a lateral move for me, but with better schools for the children and promising prospects for Melanie's graphic design business, we made the decision. We would start fresh somewhere else, somewhere without memories etched into every wall and corner. Selling our Denver home proved surprisingly easy. The market was hot, and the house itself had nothing objectively wrong with it. We disclosed nothing about our experiences. What would we say? That the property had been temporarily haunted by an ancient mountain entity? It would have been absurd, possibly fraudulent from a legal standpoint. Still, as the new owners, a young couple expecting their first child, toured the house, I found myself watching them carefully, looking for any sign they sensed something amiss. They noticed nothing, commenting only on the solid construction and updated kitchen. The night before we handed over the keys, we performed a final walkthrough of our own. Each room held memories, both ordinary family moments and the extraordinary events that had changed us forever. In Noah's room, I paused at the spot where the entity had fully manifested, where we had stood together against it. "Do you think it's really over?" Ben asked, appearing silently beside me. At 15 now, he had grown taller, his face losing its childish roundness. The events of the past year had accelerated his maturity in ways both visible and invisible. "I do," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I think we ended it." He nodded thoughtfully. "But you're still watching the new owners, checking if they feel anything." My son had always been perceptive. "Just being careful," I admitted. "But I haven't seen anything concerning." "Me neither," he said. "And I've been looking." Our new home in Portland was everything we'd hoped for. A craftsman-style house with character but without excessive age, situated in a friendly neighborhood close to good schools. It felt clean, spiritually unburdened. The children adapted with surprising speed, perhaps as eager as we were to embrace this fresh start. We didn't speak much about what had happened in Colorado, not because it was taboo. We had agreed early on that openness was essential, but because it gradually became less present in our daily consciousness. Like a wound that finally begins to heal, the experience receded from immediate pain to occasional twinge, from foreground to background. 6 months into our new life, Harold called with news. The development company had abandoned their plans for the cabin's location. After the demolition, they had encountered a series of inexplicable problems, equipment failures, worker accidents, even a small localized earthquake that affected only that specific plot of land. "They've left it alone," he said. "Put the whole project on hold indefinitely. The project manager told me off the record that his men refused to work there anymore, said it felt wrong." I wasn't surprised. Some places retain their nature, regardless of what structures stand upon them. Whatever had dwelled in that mountain existed before the cabin and would likely remain long after human memory of it faded. "What about the stone carving they found?" I asked, recalling our previous conversation. "Disappeared from the university lab where they were studying it," Harold replied. "No explanation, just gone one morning." We spoke little after that. Harold's health was declining, his voice weaker than I remembered. He never directly apologized for sending us to the cabin, but I sensed his remorse in the careful way he asked about the children, in his insistence on covering some of our relocation costs. Life in Portland suited us. Melanie's business flourished in the creative atmosphere of the city. The children made friends, joined activities, began to shed some of the hypervigilance that had characterized their post-cabin existence. I found my work engaging, my colleagues compatible. Yet sometimes, in the liminal space between waking and sleep, I would find myself listening for that familiar three-knock pattern. Occasionally, during particularly fierce storms, I would check the children's rooms multiple times in the night, reassuring myself that no tall shadows stood watching over their beds. Old habits born of trauma die hard. It was nearly 2 years after our cabin experience when the first letter arrived. No return address, postmarked from a small town in Colorado I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a brief message in unfamiliar handwriting. It chose us too. We survived. There are others. Below this cryptic statement was an email address. Nothing more. I debated sharing this with Melanie. We had worked so hard to move forward, to build our new life free from the shadow of that experience. But our pact of honesty prevailed. That night, after the children were asleep, I showed her the letter. She read it several times, her expression transitioning from confusion to recognition to determination. "We should contact them," she said finally. "If they went through what we did, they might know things we don't. Or it could be someone's sick idea of a joke," I countered, though I didn't really believe that. The wording was too specific, too knowing. Only one way to find out. The email exchange that followed revealed a family not unlike our own, parents with 3 children who had spent a weekend at a remote cabin in the same mountain range as Harold's property, though some 30 miles distant. Their experience mirrored ours in disturbing ways. The scratching in walls, the 3-knock pattern, the tall shadow figure that eventually manifested fully. "How did you find us?" I asked in one message. News article about the abandoned development project mentioned the previous owners. We tracked Harold, then you. Took time. Why contact us at all? Because it's not isolated, not rare. It's happening to others in different locations, always following the same pattern. They put us in touch with another family in Wyoming who connected us with a couple in Montana. Each had experienced nearly identical phenomena, always beginning in remote locations before following them. Our email correspondence with other families who experienced similar encounters revealed a disturbing pattern. The entity, or entities, like it, seemed to be appearing across the Rocky Mountain region, always following similar methods: isolation, manifestation, and attempted attachment to families. Through this informal network, we began gathering information, comparing experiences, identifying common elements, and most importantly, sharing methods of resistance. While our unified family stand had worked for us, others had succeeded through different means: ancient protective symbols, specific sound frequencies, or ritualistic cleansing. What emerged was a fragmented picture of something ancient that had existed in these mountains long before human settlement, something that fed on fear and isolation, that sought attachment to human consciousness as a means of extending its reach. 6 months after establishing contact with the other families, I took a sabbatical from work. With Melanie's blessing, I embarked on a research journey that took me across 4 states, meeting with indigenous elders, paranormal researchers, and other survivors. In a remote library archive, I discovered century-old journals from early settlers describing identical phenomena. A Ute elder shared oral histories of hungry shadows that would single out travelers in the mountains. A university anthropologist showed me cave paintings dating back thousands of years, depicting elongated figures surrounding human forms. The most significant breakthrough came from an elderly woman in Utah whose grandfather had been a shaman. She possessed a small leather-bound book containing what she called binding words, phonetic transcriptions of an ancient language specifically designed to repel these entities. "They are not solitary," she explained, her weathered hands tracing the faded text. "They are fragments of something larger, something broken long ago. Each seeks reunion through human hosts." This revelation aligned with our experiences, the entity's apparent need to attach itself to our family, to follow us home, to establish itself within our daily existence. What we experienced as one presence, I told Melanie upon returning home, might actually be part of something much larger trying to reconstitute itself. 3 years after our cabin ordeal, our informal network had grown to include 17 families across 6 states. We had developed a protocol for response when new cases emerged, offering guidance remotely or in-person intervention when necessary. The children, now older and more resilient, had incorporated this unusual family mission into their identities. Ben, nearing college age, planned to study anthropology and linguistics. Lily had become adept at recognizing patterns in reported incidents. Even Noah, still the most sensitive to supernatural disturbances, had found strength in helping other children process similar experiences. Harold passed away peacefully that winter. At his funeral, a stranger approached me, an elderly indigenous man who introduced himself only as Joseph. "Your father-in-law finally understood what dwelled near his cabin," he said quietly. "Before he died, he asked me to give you something." He pressed into my hand a small object wrapped in cloth. Later, when I unwrapped it privately, I found a fragment of carved stone, unmistakably a piece of the artifact discovered beneath the cabin. Inscribed on it were symbols matching those in the binding words book from Utah. With this final piece, we completed our understanding. The entities were ancient, predating human civilization in the Americas. They had once been a single consciousness, shattered and bound by the region's original inhabitants, using symbols and words of power preserved through generations. Our network now serves as modern guardians of this knowledge. We monitor reports of similar phenomena, intervene when possible, and document everything. The binding appears to be weakening with time, allowing more fragments to become active. But our collective resistance grows stronger with each encounter. The entity that entered our lives at that snowbound cabin has never returned to us. Whether truly destroyed or simply repelled, it no longer penetrates our dreams or casts shadows in our corners. But we remain vigilant, not just for ourselves, but for others who might find themselves standing in the dark, hearing that distinctive 3-knock pattern echoing through the walls. What happened to us in Colorado was real, not a ghost story. Not mass hysteria, but an encounter with something beyond ordinary understanding. In facing it together, we discovered a power older than the entity itself, the unbreakable bond of a family standing as one against the darkness. And in that discovery, we found not just survival, but purpose. The shadows are ancient, patient, and hungry, but they can be fought, they can be bound, and perhaps someday they can be understood. Until then, we keep watch. We listen for the knocking, and we remember that in our deepest moments of terror, we found a light that darkness could not extinguish. After quite the rough patch, I ended up in a rickety cabin out in the Ozarks in the winter of 2021. That's what happens when you lose your job, can't keep up with mortgage payments, and your house goes into foreclosure. It was honestly devastating. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and every day since felt like swimming upstream. Eventually, I just ran out of steam. After the bank took my home, I called in a favor from an old friend who owned a cabin in Arkansas near the edge of the woods. He said I could rent it for next to nothing, at least until I got back on my feet. I assumed it would be better than sleeping in my truck, so I packed up what little I had left and made the move. The drive down was suffocating in its loneliness. 6 hours of highways that gradually narrowed into state roads, then county roads, and finally a winding gravel path that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. My GPS lost signal about 3 miles before my destination, forcing me to navigate by the crude hand-drawn map my friend had faxed to me weeks earlier. When I finally arrived, the cabin hardly looked like salvation. It was small, with weathered grey wood that had seen at least 30 winters. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch listed noticeably to the right, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth. A stone chimney climbed up one side, black with decades of smoke. The inside wasn't much better. A main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The plumbing worked, thankfully, though the water ran brown for nearly a minute before clearing. The electricity was spotty at best, with lights that flickered whenever the ancient refrigerator kicked on, but it was mine for now. And as I unpacked my meager belongings, clothes, a few books, some framed photos of better times, I tried to convince myself that this was just temporary, that somehow, at 43 years old, I could rebuild what I'd lost. That first night, I sat on the creaking porch with a cup of instant coffee, watching darkness swallow the woods. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare winter branches clawing at the darkening sky. In the distance, an owl called, the sound echoing through the valley. I shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The first week passed in a blur of small repairs and adjustments. I fixed the leaking kitchen sink, replaced a broken window pane, and cleared years of leaves from the gutters. Physical labor helped quiet my mind, kept me from dwelling too much on what I'd lost. My daily routine took shape quickly. I'd wake at dawn, make coffee on the old gas stove, then drive to the small town 30 minutes away to use the library's internet. The librarian, a gentlewoman in her 60s, took pity on me and would save the daily newspaper. "Not many folks coming through looking for work these days," she said one morning, sliding the classified section toward me. "Most young people move away. Nothing much to hold them here." I nodded, not bothering to explain that I wasn't young and that I hadn't exactly chosen this place. I was just desperate. Each afternoon I'd return to the cabin and work on whatever needed fixing. The isolation was both blessing and curse. No one to judge me for my failures, but no one to talk to either. The silence sometimes pressed in until I could feel it in my chest, heavy and insistent. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake listening to the countless sounds of the forest. Wind through branches, animals moving in the underbrush, the occasional distant howl that might have been a coyote or might have been something else entirely. Sometimes I'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, certain I'd heard something just outside my window. The locals I encountered during my trips to town were friendly enough, but reserved. The kind of people who'd nod a greeting but wouldn't pry. At the general store, where I bought canned goods and other necessities, the owner would sometimes share bits of local knowledge. "Supposed to snow tonight," he'd say, bagging my items. "Roads get bad quick out your way. Might want to stock up." Or, "Saw some big animal tracks down by Miller's Creek yesterday. Probably just a bear, but best keep your garbage locked up tight." I appreciated his advice, but noticed how he'd watch me carefully whenever the conversation veered toward the area where my cabin was located. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, not quite concern, not quite warning, but something adjacent to both. It was during my third week that things began to change. The weather had turned milder, and new growth was appearing in the forest. I'd grown more comfortable with my surroundings, less jumpy at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Then one night, as I dozed in the threadbare armchair by the fireplace, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. Not the usual forest noises I'd grown accustomed to, but something deliberate. A slow, heavy movement along the side of the cabin. I froze, listening intently. There it was again. A shuffling sound, followed by what I could only describe as snuffling, like something with a short snout was sampling the air near my wall. My mind immediately went to bears, which I knew were common in the Ozarks. But something about the sound wasn't right. I'd encountered black bears before on camping trips years ago. They moved differently, breathed differently. This was sharper somehow, with occasional grunts that had an almost porcine quality. I sat motionless until the sounds eventually faded. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to investigate. Something primitive in my brain warned against it. The next morning, I examined the area around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, clear as day, were tracks. Large ones, pressed deep into the mud, indicating considerable weight. But they weren't bear tracks, at least none I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong, with toes that seemed too long, too articulated, and the pattern of movement suggested something that walked partly upright. I took photos with my phone, intending to ask someone in town about them, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear of appearing foolish, the city guy spooked by ordinary wildlife, or perhaps it was something deeper, an instinctive reluctance to acknowledge what I'd found. Instead, I spent the day securing the cabin, checking locks, reinforcing the flimsy back door with a chair wedged under the handle. Basic precautions, I told myself. Nothing to do with those strange prints or the unease that had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. That night the sounds returned, closer this time, more purposeful. I heard scratching at the kitchen window, a slow, deliberate drag of something hard against the glass. When I finally gathered the courage to look, pressing my face against the cold pane and squinting into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of movement, a large, hunched shape disappearing into the tree line. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent. I would hear movement outside almost every night, sometimes just passing by, other times lingering near windows or doors. I began keeping a journal, noting times and behaviors, trying to find patterns that might explain what was experiencing. One entry read, April 12th, 2:15 a.m. Heavy footsteps on porch. Stayed for approx 10 minutes. Sound of sniffing under door. Left when I accidentally knocked over lamp. Another. April 16th, dusk. Spotted large form at forest edge. Too large for coyote. Wrong shape for bear. Moved in strange, loping gait. Watched cabin for nearly an hour before retreating. The evidence mounted. Tufts of coarse, grayish hair caught on the rough wood of the porch railing. Deep claw marks on a tree near the cabin, about 6 feet off the ground. And once, a half-eaten carcass of what might have been a raccoon, left prominently in the center of the clearing, almost like an offering, or a warning. Sleep became elusive. I would jolt awake at the slightest sound, lying rigid under my blankets, straining to interpret the noises outside. Was that just the wind or something pressing against the wall? Was that distant cry an owl? Or something else entirely? My trips to town became less frequent, partly because I'd had no luck with job hunting, partly because I'd grown increasingly reluctant to leave the cabin unattended for long periods. I couldn't shake the feeling that my absence was noted, perhaps even anticipated. The general store owner commented on my haggard appearance one afternoon as I stocked up on supplies. "You looking a bit rough there," he said, eyeing the dark circles under my eyes. "Everything all right out at that cabin?" I hesitated, then asked, "Do you know if there are any unusual animals in these woods? Anything different from what you'd normally expect?" He paused in his counting of change, his expression cautious. "Different how?" "I don't know. I've been hearing things at night, seeing tracks that don't look quite right for the wildlife I know about." He studied me for a long moment before responding. "These woods are old. Older than any of us. Sometimes they hold things that don't have proper names." He pushed my change across the counter. "My advice, Don't go looking for what's looking for you. His words followed me all the way back to the cabin, settling in my mind like a splinter that couldn't be removed. By early May, whatever was visiting my cabin had grown bolder. No longer content to merely circle and investigate, it began testing boundaries. I would wake to find the screen door partially torn from its hinges, or gouges in the wooden windowsills, as if something had tried to pry them open. One morning, I discovered all my carefully hung laundry had been pulled from the line and scattered across the yard. Each item had been handled, some torn slightly, others apparently smelled or tasted, small wet spots and saliva marks evident on the fabric. The incident that truly terrified me came after a particularly heavy rainfall. I'd been in town all day and returned to find muddy prints leading directly to my front door. But what froze my blood were the handprints. Yes, handprints pressed into the mud beside the steps. They were large and misshapen, with fingers too long and joints that bent at odd angles, but unmistakably hand-like. That night, I barricaded myself inside, pushing the small couch against the door and keeping my baseball bat within reach. Outside, the familiar shuffling began earlier than usual, while the sun was still setting. I could hear it circling the cabin, pausing occasionally, then moving on. Around midnight, the first direct challenge came. A heavy thump against the door, forceful enough to shift the couch slightly. Then another. Not quite a ram, but a deliberate test of strength. I stood in the center of the room, bat raised, my breathing shallow and quick. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The response was immediate, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls, followed by a higher-pitched sound that resembled nothing so much as laughter. Not human laughter, but the mocking approximation of it, as if something was attempting to mimic a sound it had heard but didn't fully understand. The testing of the door stopped, but I could hear movement around the cabin all night. Slow, patient, circling, waiting. In the morning light, I examined the door. The wood had splintered slightly where the creature had struck it. I touched the damaged area, feeling sick. The door wouldn't withstand another such assault. That day I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought additional locks, a reinforcing metal plate for the door, and heavy-duty flashlights. I couldn't afford a gun, but I picked up bear spray, though I wasn't convinced it would be effective against whatever was stalking me. As I worked to secure the cabin, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if it wasn't trying to get in? What if it was trying to make sure I couldn't get out? The nightly visits continued, growing increasingly aggressive. The creature, I had stopped trying to classify it as any known animal, would scratch at windows for hours, an endless nerve-wracking sound that made sleep impossible. It would knock over anything I left outside, destroy any small repairs I made to the porch or steps. I began to feel that it was studying me, learning my routines, testing my responses. When I shouted or made noise, it would retreat temporarily, only to return more determined than before. When I stayed silent, it would grow bolder, pressing against the walls as if searching for weakness. One particularly awful night, it discovered that it could reach the bathroom window, which was smaller but less secure than the others. I lay in bed listening to the methodical scraping as it worked at the frame, trying to create an opening. When the glass finally shattered, I leapt up and rushed to slam the bathroom door shut. Wedging a chair under the handle, I stood in the hallway, heart hammering, as I heard something large squeeze through the window, glass tinkling as it was dislodged. Heavy breathing filled the small bathroom, then a snuffling, seeking sound as it scented the air. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the barrier between us. The door shuddered as weight pressed against it, the chair legs squeaking against the floor. I backed away, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles were white. After what seemed like hours, the pressure eased. I heard more glass breaking as the creature exited the way it had come. But it had crossed a threshold, literally and figuratively. It had breached my sanctuary, if only partially. The message was clear. Nowhere was truly safe. The next day, I boarded up the bathroom window with trembling hands. I called my friend who owned the cabin, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked if there had ever been problems with aggressive wildlife in the area. "Not that I know of," he said, "though I don't get out there much these days." "Why, something bothering you?" I couldn't bring myself to describe what was happening. It sounded too fantastical, too close to madness. "Just curious," I said. "Thought I heard something big around the cabin at night." "Probably just a bear," he replied casually. "They get pretty bold sometimes if they smell food." But it wasn't a bear. I knew that with absolute certainty. And it wasn't after food. At least not the kind you keep in a pantry. That evening, I sat at the small kitchen table, writing a lengthy entry in my journal, documenting everything that had happened. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record, something to explain what had occurred. As darkness fell, I found myself writing, "I don't think I can stay here much longer. Whatever is out there is getting more aggressive, more determined. Each night it tries something new. Each night it gets a little closer. I don't know what it wants from me, but I can feel its hunger growing. Not just physical hunger, but something deeper, a need to possess, to consume in some way I don't fully understand." I paused, a pen hovering over the page as I heard the now familiar sounds beginning outside. Tonight, they started with an almost gentle scratching at the chimney, as if it were thinking, considering, planning its approach. By late May, I had reached my breaking point. Sleep deprivation and constant fear had worn me down to a shell of myself. I'd lost weight, my hands shook constantly, and I jumped at the slightest sound. The creature's visits had become a nightly certainty, each one more prolonged and intense than the last. I had decided to leave, to abandon the cabin, and whatever strange territory dispute or hunting ritual I had unwittingly become part of. I'd packed my few belongings and planned to depart at first light, when I hoped the creature would be least active. My last evening in the cabin was unseasonably warm. The air felt heavy, charged with an approaching storm. I sat on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee, trying to savor one final moment of peace before my escape. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and the woods smelled of wet earth and new growth. That's when my sixth sense alerted me, that primitive part of the brain that knows when you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly turned my head toward the tree line to my left. There it was, partially obscured by a large oak, but visible enough to freeze my blood. Large and hunched, covered in patchy grey fur that revealed sickly, pale skin beneath. Its face was elongated, with a short, pig-like snout, and eyes that reflected the dying sunlight like dull coins. It stood on two legs, but seemed uncomfortable with the posture, its long arms hanging almost to the ground. Our eyes met across the clearing. For a moment neither of us moved. Then it opened its mouth, revealing yellow teeth too numerous and too sharp to belong to any normal omnivore, and released a sound that began as a grunt and rose to a high-pitched screech. I dropped my coffee mug, which shattered on the porch boards. My paralysis broke, and I bolted toward the cabin door. But even as I moved, I knew I'd made a critical mistake. I should have remained still, should have backed slowly into the cabin. The sudden movement triggered something primal in the creature, and it surged forward with shocking speed. I sprinted off the porch, veering away from the cabin door, hoping to circle around and approach from another angle. My boots slipped in the mud as I heard crashing behind me, branches breaking, undergrowth being trampled by something heavy and fast. The creature's breathing was loud, wet, and ragged, unnervingly close. I weaved between pine trees, changing direction erratically, using the trunks as barriers. Once I nearly slammed face first into a tree, barely managing to pivot at the last second. I could feel hot breath on my neck, hear snapping jaws just inches from my back. Panic gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. When I spotted the yellow glow of the porch light through the trees, I made a desperate final push. Somehow, miraculously, I reached the porch. I hurled myself at the door, wrenching it open and tumbling inside. My shoulder collided painfully with the door frame, but adrenaline dulled the sensation. I kicked the door shut with my foot and threw the bolt just as something heavy slammed against the other side. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Outside, the creature howled, a deep, mournful sound that shifted into that horrible pig-like squeal. The porch boards creaked under its weight as it paced back and forth. For several minutes, it scratched and pawed at the door, testing the reinforcements I'd installed. I remained frozen on the floor, afraid that even the smallest movement might provoke it further. Then, abruptly, the sounds stopped. The silence was almost more terrifying than the attack had been. I strained to hear anything, breathing, movement, any indication of where it had gone. But there was nothing. I spent that night huddled in the center of the room, baseball bat in hand, jumping at every creak and settling sound the old cabin made. But the creature didn't return. Dawn found me still awake, still clutching the bat. As sunlight filtered through the curtains, I gathered my courage and peered outside. The clearing was empty, peaceful in the morning light. Birds sang in the trees as if nothing had happened. I waited until mid-morning before venturing out, moving cautiously, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. But the woods seemed normal, almost indifferent to the terror of the previous night. Evidence remained, though deep prints in the mud showing the creature's pursuit, claw marks on trees where it had used them to change direction during the chase. Near the porch, I found clumps of that coarse grey fur caught on a nail, and what looked disturbingly like saliva dried on the door, thick and yellowish, with an acrid smell that made my stomach turn. I didn't linger. I threw my bags into the truck and left, gravel spitting from beneath my tires as I accelerated down the narrow road. I didn't stop until I reached the town, where I pulled into the general store parking lot and sat with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The owner was sweeping the front step when I approached. He took one look at my face and nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "You're leaving then," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. "I can't stay in that cabin anymore." He leaned on his broom, studying me. "It found you, did it? The thing in the woods." My mouth went dry. "You know about it?" He sighed heavily. "Stories go back generations around here. Most folks don't see it. Some feel it watching. A few," he gestured toward me, "a few get its full attention. What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't rightly know," he admitted. "Some say it's just a deformed bear or wild hog. Others claim it's something older, something that was here before people. All I know is it seems to fixate on certain folks, and once it does, it doesn't stop until they're gone. Or dead." I couldn't help asking. He looked away. "There have been disappearances over the years. Hunters, hikers, people who stayed too long." I thanked him, though for what exactly I wasn't sure. As I turned to leave, he called after me. "It won't follow you if that's what you're worried about. It stays in its territory. Always has." His words provided small comfort as I drove away from the Ozarks, constantly checking my rearview mirror until the hills disappeared from view. That was 3 years ago. Life has been kinder since then. I found steady work in a city hundreds of miles away, moved into a small apartment in a densely populated neighborhood where the only nighttime sounds are traffic and occasional sirens. Sometimes I still wake in a cold sweat, certain I've heard snuffling outside my window or scratching at my door. The nightmares come less frequently now, but they haven't stopped entirely. In them, I'm always running through endless woods. Something just behind me, its breath hot on my neck. I researched extensively after I left, looking for any scientific explanation for what I encountered. The closest match was reports of feral hogs, which can grow to enormous sizes and have been known to walk short distances on their hind legs. But this explanation feels hollow, inadequate to describe what stalked me in those woods. I never went back to collect the journal I left behind. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has found it, if they've read my increasingly desperate entries and dismissed them as the ramblings of an isolated, grieving man. Or worse, if they've recognized the truth in them because they've experienced something similar. There are things in this world we don't fully understand. Creatures that exist in the margins between what we know and what we fear. I can't explain what happened to me in the Ozarks, can't neatly categorize or classify the thing that hunted me for those terrible weeks. All I know is that there are places where humans are not the apex predator, where we are little more than intruders, tolerated until we're not. And when toleration ends, all we can do is run and hope that we're faster than whatever is chasing us. Just wilderness and the promise of peaceful reflection. Although I wasn't particularly skilled in wilderness survival, I could handle the basics. I knew how to split firewood with a maul, perform simple repairs with a basic toolkit, and had enough common sense to store food properly in bear country. The owner, an elderly gentleman named Howard, had given me a thorough orientation before handing over the keys for my 6-month rental. "It gets mighty quiet out here," he'd warned with a knowing smile. "Some folks find it peaceful. Others get spooked by their own shadows after a while." I assured him I would be fine. I'd brought enough books to last me a year. My laptop was loaded with work projects, and I had a satellite internet connection for emergencies. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Time to finish my novel away from distractions and reset my mental state. April arrived with a stunning display of nature awakening. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots pushing through the forest floor. Birds returned from their winter migrations, filling the mornings with their calls. I established a comfortable routine, writing in the mornings, taking long walks in the afternoons, and spending evenings reading by the wood stove or on the porch when weather permitted. For the first 3 weeks, everything was idyllic. I made significant progress on my manuscript and felt the tension I'd carried from the city gradually uncoiling from my shoulders and mind. The nighttime silence was profound, a stillness so complete that sometimes I would step outside just to marvel at the vastness of the star-filled sky, unmarred by light pollution. My first hint that something was amiss came in early May, about a month into my stay. I woke unusually early one morning, drawn from sleep by some indefinable discomfort. The grey light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the kitchen window as I made coffee. That's when I saw it, a white-tailed deer standing approximately 20 yards from the cabin. At first, I felt a surge of delight. Wildlife sightings were common enough, but I'd grown up in urban environments where such encounters were rare. But as I observed the animal, an uncomfortable awareness crept over me. The deer wasn't behaving naturally. It stood completely motionless, muscles tensed, eyes fixed directly on my window. Not on the cabin generally, but precisely on me. The deer's unnatural stillness disturbed me. Wildlife typically exhibits constant small movements, ears flicking to detect sounds, tails swishing to deter insects, heads bobbing as they graze. This animal displayed none of those behaviors. It remained frozen like a taxidermied specimen, eyes unblinking and fixed on my position. I tapped gently on the window glass, expecting it to startle and bound away into the forest. Nothing happened. I rapped more firmly, then called out. The deer remained statue-like, its dark eyes maintaining that unnerving focus. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I stepped onto the porch, thinking my physical presence would certainly trigger its flight response. Instead, the deer finally moved, but not in panic or haste. It turned with deliberate slowness and walked, not bounded or ran away into the trees. Its gait was measured and unnaturally steady, as though it were performing a prescribed role rather than acting on instinct. I tried to dismiss the incident. "You're not experienced with wildlife," I reminded myself. "Animals behave differently in the wild than they do in documentaries or zoos." The explanation felt thin, but I clung to it, unwilling to acknowledge the cold discomfort settling in my stomach. The following week passed without incident, and I gradually relaxed back into my routine. The productive solitude I'd sought had returned, and my manuscript was developing well. I'd nearly forgotten about the deer when around 2 a.m. on a moonless night, I was startled awake by a rhythmic thumping against the side of the cabin. I lay motionless in bed, listening. The sound continued, a deliberate, measured beat against the wooden exterior, not random or wind-driven, but purposeful. After several minutes of this unsettling percussion, I finally gathered the courage to investigate. Switching on the porch light, I peered through the kitchen window. Near the garbage bins stood a raccoon, illuminated in the yellow glow. Like the deer before it, this animal wasn't behaving naturally. Raccoons are typically skittish and quick, nervous thieves that scurry away at the first sign of human presence. This one remained in place, slowly turning its masked face toward me when the light came on. Its eyes reflected the porch light with an unnatural brightness, appearing almost luminous. As I watched, it deliberately climbed the porch railing, not with the quick, agile movements characteristic of its species, but with a slow, methodical ascent. When it reached the top, it moved to the screen door and pressed its nose against the mesh, staring directly at me through the barrier. I banged loudly on the inside door, hoping to scare it away. The raccoon hissed in response but didn't retreat. Only when I grabbed a broom and thrust it against the screen did the animal finally descend from the railing. Even then, it merely waddled a short distance before disappearing into the darkness of the surrounding woods. Looking back once, with what I could only interpret as purpose. In the days that followed, I began noticing other unusual animal behaviors with increasing frequency. Gray squirrels would perch on fence posts or tree stumps near the cabin, remaining completely still for hours, their bodies oriented toward the building as if listening. A fox crossed the clearing one afternoon and froze mid-stride when it spotted me watching through the window. It stood there, one paw lifted, for nearly 10 minutes before continuing on its way. Most disturbing was the morning I awoke to find 6 crows arrayed on a single branch of the pine tree closest to my bedroom window. They formed an unnaturally perfect line, evenly spaced, everyone facing the cabin. No calls, no preening, no shuffling of wings, just silent, unwavering observation. When I approached the window, their heads synchronously tilted, tracking my movement, but not a single feather otherwise stirred. The cumulative effect of these encounters was eroding my peace of mind. I found myself keeping the curtains drawn more often, checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, and startling at ordinary forest sounds that I had previously found soothing. My writing began to suffer as my concentration fractured. During a supply run to town, I mentioned some of these incidents to Thomas, the owner of the general store, who had become something of a friendly acquaintance during my stay. "Animals acting strange, you say?" he questioned, leaning on the counter as he rang up my groceries. "Yes, they seem to be. Watching the cabin." "Watching me?" I explained, immediately regretting my phrasing when I saw the skeptical lift of his eyebrow. "Well, that area's got some mighty curious critters," Thomas said with a chuckle. "But if you think something odd's going on, why not set up some wildlife cameras? Could be a neat project, might help you figure out what's actually happening versus what your city boy imagination is cooking up." His suggestion, despite its slightly condescending delivery, made practical sense. That afternoon, I purchased 3 trail cameras from the sporting goods section of the store. The next day, I mounted them strategically around the property, one facing the front approach to the cabin, another covering the back clearing, and the third positioned to monitor the path leading into the deeper woods. I told myself this was merely a scientific experiment, a way to prove to myself that nothing unusual was occurring. But as I secured the last camera to a tree trunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed from multiple directions. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me, the normal ambient sounds momentarily suspended. 3 days later, I retrieved the memory cards and reviewed the footage on my laptop. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions and introduced new, more disturbing elements to the situation. The cameras had captured numerous animals approaching the cabin area. In almost every instance, the behavior followed a pattern. The animal would enter the frame, move normally for a few seconds, then abruptly pause and turn directly toward the camera. Even when the device was well hidden, the creature would then remain motionless, staring directly at the lens, for periods ranging from several minutes to, in one case, over an hour. The most unsettling footage came from the camera facing the woods. It had captured a red fox approaching just after sunset. The animal moved with typical vulpine grace until it seemed to sense the camera. It stopped, sat down, and tilted its head at an angle that appeared anatomically impossible, nearly 90 degrees from its normal position. It maintained this unnatural posture, eyes fixed on the lens, for 17 minutes before suddenly straightening and departing, as if responding to an inaudible command. Other recordings showed similar disturbing behaviors. A family of opossums walking in perfect single-file formation, stopping simultaneously to stare at the camera. A pair of owls that remained motionless on a branch for hours, their heads swiveling in perfect synchronization to follow something moving outside the camera's range. 3 separate deer that approached the cabin at precisely the same time on consecutive nights, forming a triangle formation before departing. The footage confirmed I wasn't imagining things, but it offered no explanation. If anything, it deepened the mystery and intensified my growing unease. I found myself spending more time indoors, my productive writing routine disrupted by vigilant window checking and startled responses to ordinary sounds. One evening in early June, as twilight descended, I heard a distinctive scratching sound from the roof. At first, I attributed it to pine branches scraping the shingles in the wind, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. Steeling myself, I stepped onto the porch and looked up. Perched at the peak of the roof was a bald eagle, an impressive sight under normal circumstances, but this was different. The massive bird was hunched forward, its white head tilted downward to fix me with an unblinking stare. Eagles are magnificent predators, but they typically avoid human habitation and certainly don't perch on occupied buildings. We observed each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes. The eagle's eyes held none of the keen, wild intelligence I would expect from such a creature. Instead, they appeared dull and clouded, almost as if something else were looking through them, using them as windows. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the cabin, jumping at every creak and groan of the old structure settling. The animal's behavior had progressed beyond curious to threatening, carrying an undercurrent of malevolence I couldn't rationalize away. Something was observing me through these creatures, learning my routines, my responses, perhaps waiting for what? I considered abandoning my stay early but hesitated. I had nearly 3 months remaining on my lease, had paid in full, and my manuscript was only half completed. More importantly, leaving felt like surrendering to an irrational fear, admitting that wildlife had somehow driven me from my temporary home. The following week brought an unusual heat wave to the region. Temperatures climbed into the high 80s, unusual for northern Minnesota in early summer. The hot, still air hung heavy among the pines, carrying the intense scent of resin and warming earth. I had taken to working primarily in the early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the stifling midday heat. As the sun began its descent one evening, I decided to take a walk along the property's perimeter, hoping to catch a cooling breeze. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, just the occasional soft crunch of pine needles beneath my boots. I had reached the northern edge of the clearing, about a quarter mile from the cabin, when I heard rustling in the dense undergrowth ahead. I stopped, listening intently. The movement sounded larger than a raccoon or fox, something substantial, displacing branches and ground cover. Emerging from the shadows between 2 ancient pine trees came a shape that made my breath catch. It was a wolf, or something very close to a wolf, but wrong in ways that registered immediately, even to my untrained eye. The animal was gaunt, with protruding ribs visible beneath patchy fur. Several areas showed bare skin that appeared raw and inflamed. Its movements were stiff and irregular, lacking the fluid grace typical of large predators. Most disturbing were its eyes, clouded and milky, like those of a blind animal, yet somehow tracking my position with perfect precision. The creature's breath came in labored, rasping pants, visible as small puffs of condensation despite the warm evening air. I recalled reading about wildlife encounters. Make yourself appear larger. Make noise. Back away slowly without turning your back. I raised my arms above my head, clapped my hands sharply, and called out in what I hoped was an authoritative voice. The wolf showed no reaction beyond slightly tilting its head, studying my display with what appeared to be cold curiosity rather than caution. Then it took a stumbling step forward, another. Its movement accelerated into an uneven but rapid charge directly toward me. In that moment, all wilderness advice evaporated from my mind. Primal fear took control, and I turned and ran, the worst possible response to a predator, but the only one my body would execute. I sprinted toward the cabin, hearing the animal's labored breathing and the thud of paws against earth close behind me. The distance seemed impossibly vast. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder than I had in years. Passing too close to a tree, I felt my pant leg catch and tear, bark scraping painfully against my knee. The wolf was gaining, so close that I could smell its rank odor, a combination of wet fur and something putrid underneath. I reached the porch steps, taking them 3 at a time, fumbling with trembling hands for the door handle. Behind me, I heard the wolf's claws scrabbling on the wooden steps. I crashed through the door and slammed it shut, just as a heavy weight thudded against the other side. The assault on the door continued, scratching, thumping, occasional frustrated growls that sounded disturbingly unlike natural wolf vocalizations. They were interspersed with a strange, wet coughing sound. I backed away, grabbing a heavy poker from beside the wood stove as a makeshift weapon. For nearly 10 minutes, the creature continued its attempt to breach the entrance. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No retreating footsteps, no further growls, not even the sound of breathing from the other side of the door. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, I gathered my courage to approach the window beside the door. Peering cautiously through a narrow gap in the curtains, I expected to see the wolf still lurking on the porch. There was nothing. No wolf, no fresh scratches on the wooden door, not even tracks in the dirt where it should have passed. I spent that night huddled in the main room, poker clutched in white-knuckled hands, jumping at every sound. By morning, exhaustion had overcome fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep in the armchair. When I woke, harsh sunlight was streaming through the windows. The events of the previous evening took on a dreamlike quality in the brightness of day. Had I imagined it all? A quick check of my torn pants and the scrape on my knee confirmed the reality of my flight. But when I examined the door and porch, I found no evidence of the wolf, no claw marks, no fur, nothing to corroborate my experience. I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever was happening, whether supernatural phenomenon, elaborate psychological breakdown, or some unexplained wildlife behavior, had progressed beyond my capacity to rationalize or endure. I packed essential belongings into my car that afternoon, locked the cabin, and drove straight to town. I checked into the only motel in the small community and called Howard to explain that I would be terminating my rental early due to unexpected circumstances. To his credit, he didn't press for details when he heard the tremor in my voice, simply asking if the property was secure and agreeing to meet the following day to collect the keys. "Happens sometimes," he said cryptically. "The woods aren't for everyone." I couldn't bring myself to fully articulate what I'd experienced. Instead, I told Howard that I'd been having trouble with unusually aggressive wildlife and felt unsafe. He nodded, expression unreadable as he accepted the keys. "That place has always attracted critters," he remarked. more than other properties around here. Some folks find it charming." He hesitated, then added, "Previous tenant mentioned something similar, now that I think about it. Scientist type studying forest ecology. Said the animal behavior around that cabin would make for an interesting research paper." I wanted to ask more about this previous tenant, about whether Howard had experienced anything similar during his ownership, about the history of the property, but the words stuck in my throat. Part of me feared the answers might confirm the nameless dread that had taken root in me. I stayed with a friend in town for another week, ostensibly to recover from a minor injury, while arranging to have my remaining belongings shipped from the cabin. I didn't broadcast the true nature of my experiences, merely explaining that I wanted to be closer to amenities as I finished my work. 5 years have passed since those events. I completed my novel after returning to the city, though its tone and themes darkened considerably from my original concept. It was eventually published to modest success, the critics noting its palpable atmosphere of environmental dread and unusually vivid depictions of wilderness as a sentient, potentially malevolent force. I've never returned to Minnesota. When I think back on those months, I still struggle to formulate a rational explanation for what occurred. The most scientifically plausible theory, some form of widespread rabies or other disease affecting local wildlife, fails to account for the coordination I observed, the apparent communication between different species, and the complete absence of physical evidence following the wolf encounter. Occasionally, I search online for reports of similar experiences in that region. There's little to find beyond the usual cryptozoology forums and paranormal speculation sites. Once I came across a brief news item about a wildlife biologist who had gone missing while conducting research in the general vicinity of my cabin. The article mentioned their specialized focus was on anomalous collective behaviors in diverse species populations. The investigation was ongoing, with authorities suggesting a possible accident in the remote terrain. The nightmares have mostly subsided now. I no longer wake in a cold sweat, convinced that something is watching me through the eyes of urban pigeons or the neighbor's cat. But I've developed a wariness around animals that persists, a tendency to monitor their behavior for any sign of that unnatural stillness, that focused attention that suggests something other than animal consciousness behind their eyes. Sometimes, when I'm walking in the city park near dusk and notice a squirrel or bird becoming suddenly, unnaturally still, I find myself quickening my pace, heart racing as I head toward more populated areas and artificial light. It's probably nothing, just an ordinary wildlife response to a human presence. Probably. What troubles me most, looking back, isn't the fear I experienced or even the inexplicable nature of the events. It's the gradual realization that has formed in me over the intervening years. Whatever was happening in those woods wasn't beginning during my stay. It was escalating. The progression was clear in retrospect. First simple observation, the deer at the window, the squirrels on the fence posts. Then more coordinated monitoring, the crows on the branch, the fox's impossible head tilt. Finally, active approach, the raccoon at the door, the eagle on the roof. Culminating in the wolf's direct assault. It suggests purpose, patience, and planning, qualities that transcend individual animal consciousness. Something was using the local wildlife as instruments of observation, perhaps even as potential vessels for more direct interaction. The clouded eyes I noted in several creatures, particularly the wolf, hint at some form of control or influence over their normal instincts and behaviors. I've developed theories in the years since, each more unsettling than the last. Perhaps the land itself possessed some form of awareness, using the creatures that dwelled upon it as sensory organs and instruments of will. Or maybe something ancient dwelled in those woods, something that had learned to extend its influence through the simpler minds of animals, watching and waiting for. What, a suitable human host? A moment of vulnerability. I never felt comfortable sharing these speculations with others. Even now, committing them to paper makes me question my own rationality. But I know what I experienced. The details remain vivid. The unnatural stillness, the coordinated behaviors, the sense of being systematically studied by something using borrowed eyes. Most disturbing is the question that still haunts me. What would have happened if I had stayed? Would the progression have continued to its logical conclusion? And what exactly would that conclusion have been? I've come to believe that my decision to leave was not merely prudent, but possibly life-saving. The isolation that initially attracted me to the cabin was precisely what made it an ideal location for whatever was occurring there. No witnesses, no interference, just one human subject and countless animal observers, controlled by something with unknown intentions. I still write, though I've transitioned primarily to non-fiction. My brief unexplained encounter with the abnormal has left me with a persistent sense that the natural world contains mysteries beyond our current understanding, phenomena that exist in the margins between established science and folklore. I don't expect to ever fully understand what happened during those months in Minnesota. Perhaps that's for the best. Some questions may be safer left unanswered, some knowledge better left undiscovered. But I remain vigilant, particularly when alone in natural settings. And I never ignore that primal instinct that occasionally whispers, "You are being watched." I first noticed something was wrong the day we moved into the house on Pinecrest Road. It was October 2020, and I had just turned 14. My mother, in the aftermath of a bitter divorce, had relocated us to what must have been the smallest town in Montana, a forgettable speck on the map consisting of 2 gas stations, a white-steepled church, a consolidated school building, several bars that seemed to outnumber the actual residents, and a scattering of houses that had seen better days. Our new house sat at the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel roads that disappeared into thick pine forest. It was a 2-story affair with peeling white paint and sagging shutters, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and an upstairs area that creaked with every step. Nothing exceptional, except for the eeriness that settled over me the moment I stepped through the front door. "This is home now," Mom said, setting down the last of our boxes in the living room. Her smile was stretched thin, the kind of forced optimism that didn't reach her eyes. She was trying so hard to make this work for us. My younger brother Quinn, we called him Q, bounded up the stairs, claiming the smaller bedroom that overlooked the backyard. I followed more slowly, dragging my feet with each step. Something felt off about this place, like the walls were holding their breath. My bedroom was at the end of the hallway. Previous tenants had painted it a pale blue that had faded to the color of a winter sky. It had a window that faced the street, a closet with a peeling door, and oddly, a small crawl-space entrance built into the back wall of that closet, reminiscent of something from a children's fantasy book. "What do you think?" Mom asked from the doorway. "It's fine," I lied, dropping my backpack onto the bare mattress. It wasn't fine. Something about the room made my skin prickle. Later that night, as I was unpacking my clothes, I felt it for the first time, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, expecting to see Q or my mother standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway and the sounds of Mom unpacking dishes downstairs. I shook it off. New house jitters, I told myself. But as I turned back to my suitcase, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow where no shadow should be. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. The shadow, if it had ever been there at all, was gone. Over the next few weeks, Mom's boyfriend Trevor moved in with his son Dylan, who was a year younger than me. We settled into a routine of sorts, school during the day, awkward family dinners at night, everyone pretending we were just a normal blended family in a normal house in a normal town. But I knew better, because every night When the house grew quiet and the only sound was the wind in the pines outside my window, I felt those eyes on me again, watching, waiting for what I didn't know. By November, the sensation of being watched had become my constant companion. It followed me through the house like an unwelcome shadow. In the kitchen, as I poured my morning cereal, in the bathroom as I brushed my teeth, in the living room as I pretended to focus on homework. "You've been quiet lately," Mom noted one evening as she folded laundry. "Everything okay at school?" School was actually the only place I felt normal. "School's fine," I said, not meeting her eyes. How could I explain that our house felt wrong? That every room seemed to hold invisible presences that pressed against my consciousness? "Is it Trevor and Dylan?" she pressed, lowering her voice. "I know it's an adjustment." "It's not them," I interrupted. "I'm just tired." I didn't tell her about the shadows I'd begun to see more frequently, dark silhouettes that gathered in corners or lingered in doorways, visible only from the corner of my eye. When I turned to look directly, they melted away, but the feeling of their presence lingered. I tried researching what was happening to me. Late at night, I'd huddle under my blankets with my phone's blue light illuminating my face, searching terms like shadow people and feeling watched in-house. The results both terrified and comforted me. I wasn't alone in experiencing these phenomena. Thousands of people reported similar occurrences. I'd always been fascinated by the paranormal and occult. Before moving, I'd even dabbled in some harmless rituals with friends. Ouija boards, light as a feather, silly things we never took seriously. But now I wondered if something had followed me, if I'd somehow opened a door that refused to close. My interest in the paranormal intensified with my experiences. I downloaded ghost hunting apps, though I knew they were probably fake. I set up my phone to record audio while I slept, hoping to capture evidence of whatever was happening. The recordings never showed anything conclusive, just the normal settling sounds of an old house, the occasional creak that could be explained away. But one night in early December, I captured something that sent ice through my veins. The audio was mostly silent for the first few hours. Then around 3:17 a.m., there was a whisper so faint I had to increase the volume and listen repeatedly to make it out. "We see you," it seemed to say, though the voice was distorted and could have been anything. Wind through a crack in the window, a car passing on the distant highway, my own breathing as I slept. I deleted the recording immediately, my hands shaking. That night I dreamed of dark figures standing around my bed, their faces featureless except for gleaming pale eyes, that watched me with an intensity that felt physical, like fingers pressed against my skin. I woke gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. The room was empty, but the feeling of being observed remained, heavier than ever. By January, winter had transformed our little Montana town into a frozen landscape of white snow and black trees. The days were short, darkness falling by mid-afternoon and not lifting until late morning. This expansion of night seemed to strengthen whatever presence lurked in our house. The shadow people, as I'd come to think of them, grew bolder. No longer content to remain in my peripheral vision, they now manifested directly in my line of sight, tall, humanoid figures of absolute darkness that stood motionless, watching. The first time I saw one clearly, I was brushing my teeth before bed. I glanced up into the bathroom mirror and froze. Standing in the doorway behind me was a figure so black it seemed to absorb the dim light of the bathroom. It had no features I could discern, just a human-shaped void in reality. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My toothbrush clattered into the sink as my hand went numb. When I finally managed to whirl around, the doorway was empty. "Did you see that?" I demanded when I burst into Q's room moments later. He looked up from his tablet, annoyed at the interruption. "See what?" "In the hallway, a shadow person." Q stared at me for a long moment before returning to his game. "You're being weird again." But a week later, Q came to me, his face pale. "I saw something," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my room, standing by the closet, A chill ran through me. What did it look like? Like nothing, just darkness shaped like a person, his small hands twisted in his shirt. It was watching me. That same night, Dylan knocked on my bedroom door well past midnight. When I opened it, his face was drawn with fear. "There's someone in my room," he said flatly, as if admitting something shameful. "I've been seeing them for weeks." I thought I was going crazy. We huddled in my room that night, all three of us, backs against the wall, lights on, taking turns to stay awake. None of us mentioned what we'd seen to our parents. What would we say? How could we explain the shadow people without sounding delusional? The shadow figures didn't touch us, didn't approach us, didn't speak. They simply watched, their presence growing more frequent and more palpable with each passing day. Sometimes I'd see them standing at the foot of my bed when I woke in the middle of the night. Other times, they'd be in the corner of the living room while we watched TV, or in the kitchen during dinner, invisible to the adults but clearly visible to me. I began to recognize individual shadows, one tall and thin that preferred the hallway, another broader that lingered near windows, and a third, smaller one that only appeared in my bedroom. I gave them names in my head, but never spoke them aloud, fearing that acknowledgement might somehow strengthen them. Despite their constant presence, I convinced myself they meant no harm. They were observers, not participants. If I ignored them, perhaps they would eventually lose interest and leave. I was wrong. The scratches began in February. I woke one morning to a stinging sensation along my side. When I checked in the bathroom mirror, I discovered 3 thin, shallow scratches running parallel to each other just below my ribs. They weren't deep, barely breaking the skin, but they definitely hadn't been there when I went to bed. "Did you do this in your sleep?" Mom asked when I showed her, concern creasing her forehead. I shook my head. "I don't think so. Our dogs didn't sleep in my room. And I had no history of injuring myself while sleeping. The scratches healed quickly, and I almost convinced myself it had been a fluke. Maybe I'd scraped against something in my sleep. Or perhaps the springs in my old mattress were finally giving way. Then it happened again, and again, always in places I couldn't easily reach myself. My back, the back of my arms, my sides. Always shallow, always in sets of 3, always appearing overnight while I slept. I began wearing long sleeves to bed, despite the warmth of the house. I pushed my bed away from the walls, removed everything that could possibly scratch me. I even set up my phone to record video all night, propped on my dresser with a clear view of my bed. The recordings showed nothing unusual, just me sleeping, occasionally turning or mumbling. No shadowy hands reaching out to mark my skin, no explanation for the scratches that continued to appear. But the videos did capture something else. The shadow figures, now clearly visible to the camera. They appeared as dark smudges against the deeper darkness of my room, moving with an unnatural smoothness around my bed. 3 of them always circling like silent predators. I showed the footage to Q and Dylan, who confirmed what I'd been seeing. What we'd all been seeing. "We need to tell them," Dylan insisted, referring to our parents. "And say what?" I countered. "That we're being haunted by shadow people who scratch me in my sleep. They'll think we're making it up, or worse, that I'm hurting myself again." My history of self-harm had been brief but intense the previous year, following the divorce. Mum had removed anything sharp from my possession and still checked my arms periodically, her eyes sad and worried. "Then what do we do?" Q asked, his voice small. I had no answer. We continued to endure in silence, watching the watchers, pretending everything was normal when our parents were around. But one morning in early March, I discovered something that shattered any remaining doubt about what was happening in our house. I opened my closet to get dressed for school and noticed something odd about the small door that led to the crawl space. Leaning closer, I realized the wood was marked with dozens of shallow carvings, symbols and letters that formed no words I recognized, arranged in patterns that made my head hurt to look at. I touched one of the carvings, feeling the rough indentation under my fingertip. These weren't scratches made by animals or normal wear and tear. They were deliberate, precise, created with a sharp instrument. And they weren't there the day before, I was certain of it. I had no knives, no tools, nothing sharp enough to make these marks. My door squeaked loudly when opened, and I used a doorstop as a makeshift lock, since the actual lock was oddly placed on the outside of the door. There was no way someone could have entered my room without waking me, unless they weren't someone at all. As winter reluctantly released its grip on Montana, we began spending more time outdoors. The backyard of our house was separated from the front by a flimsy chain-link fence that stood no higher than my chest. Beyond the backyard lay a small shed, and then the beginning of the woods, dense pines that seemed to absorb light and sound. One evening in late April, Dylan and I were tossing a frisbee in the front yard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the patchy grass. Mom was inside preparing dinner. While Q and Trevor had gone to bed early with matching colds, I was laughing at Dylan's failed attempt to catch the frisbee when I felt it. That familiar sensation of being watched, but stronger than ever before, like physical pressure against my back. I turned slowly toward the house, my breath catching in my throat. 3 figures stood at the back corner of the house, partially concealed by the wall, but clearly leaning forward to observe us. They weren't the shadow people we'd grown accustomed to inside. These figures had substance, a physical presence that was undeniable even at a distance. They were tall, adult-sized, with the basic shape of men, but completely black as if carved from the night itself. Most terrifying were their eyes, large round orbs of yellowish white that glowed with an internal light fixed unblinkingly on us. I froze, the frisbee forgotten at my feet. "Dylan," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figures. "Do you see that too?" I heard his sharp intake of breath. "By the fence." "Yeah, what the hell are those?" The figures didn't move, didn't approach, just watched us with those terrible glowing eyes. As we stared, one of them tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if curious about our reaction. That small movement broke the spell of our paralysis. Without a word, we both turned and ran for the front door, tumbling inside and slamming it behind us. We stood with our backs against it, breathing hard, unable to speak. "What are you two doing?" Mom called from the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready." Dylan and I exchanged glances. "Nothing," I called back, my voice surprisingly steady. "Just got cold out there." That night, I pulled the blinds on every window in my room and pushed my dresser in front of the closet door. I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around me, jumping at every creak and groan. When I finally fell asleep near dawn, I dreamed of those glowing eyes watching me from every window of the house, pressing their faces against the glass, waiting for me to look back. The following day, Dylan and I conducted a thorough investigation of the backyard and the area around the house. We found nothing unusual, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. But as we neared the shed, we both felt the same heavy sensation of being observed. "They're still here," Dylan murmured, glancing nervously at the tree line. "Just hiding." For the next few weeks, we began seeing the figures everywhere, standing among the trees at the edge of the property, peering through windows at night, watching us from doorways. Unlike the shadow people inside the house, these entities seemed more purposeful, more aware. They weren't just observing anymore. They were following us. In May, while cleaning out a seldom-used cabinet in the kitchen, Mom found an old leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. "Look at this," she said, showing it to me. "Must have belonged to a previous tenant." I took the journal, feeling an inexplicable dread as my fingers touched the worn leather. "Can I read it?" Mom shrugged. "Sure, probably just boring household accounts or something." But it wasn't. The journal belonged to someone named Thomas Wilder, who had lived in our house from 1967 to 1968. The entries started normally enough: complaints about the plumbing, notes about plantings in the garden, observations about neighbors long since gone. Then, about midway through, the tone changed. June 17th, 1967. I've been feeling strange lately, like I'm never alone in this house. Margaret says I'm being ridiculous, but sometimes I turn around expecting to see someone behind me. There's never anyone there. July 3rd, 1967. The feeling is getting worse. Today, I saw something in the upstairs hallway, a shape darker than the shadows, moving when it shouldn't. Margaret didn't see it. Says I'm working too hard. August 12th, 1967. They're watching me. I know how that sounds, but I'm not crazy. They stand in corners, by windows at the foot of our bed. Black figures with eyes like dim lanterns. Margaret still sees nothing, but Josephine said she saw a shadow man in her closet last night. She's only 6. How would she know to describe them that way if she hadn't seen them? The entries continued, becoming more frantic, more detailed in their descriptions of the shadow people. Thomas wrote about scratches appearing on his body overnight, about symbols carved into the walls of the crawl space that he couldn't explain, about the watchers becoming bolder, moving from inside the house to the property boundaries. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1968. They're coming closer every night. Standing at the windows now, watching us sleep. Margaret finally saw one yesterday. She wants to leave, but where would we go? They'll follow us, I know it. They've attached themselves to me somehow. To us. Last night I woke to find one standing over Josephine's bed. Just watching. I don't know what they want. I don't know what they are. If anyone finds this journal, stay away from this house. They're hungry for something I can't name. The journal ended there. No explanation of what happened to Thomas and his family, no resolution to their haunting. I searched online for any record of the Wilders, but found nothing. No news stories, no obituaries, no indication of where they went after leaving our house. But I knew now that what we were experiencing wasn't new, wasn't unique to us. This house had a history, and we were just the latest chapter in its dark story. I showed the journal to Dylan and Q, but we agreed not to tell our parents. What good would it do? We had no proof beyond the ramblings of a man 50 years dead and our own increasingly frightening experiences. By June, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The scratches on my body had become deeper, more frequent. The shadow people no longer disappeared when I looked directly at them, but remained visible, sometimes for minutes at a time before fading away. The 3 watchers with the glowing eyes had grown bolder, appearing closer to the house each night. We were all sleeping poorly. Q had developed dark circles under his eyes. Dylan had become jumpy and irritable, and I found myself nodding off in class, too afraid to sleep deeply at night. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was just after midnight on a Tuesday. I was still awake, as usual, sitting cross-legged on my bed with all the lights on, trying to focus on homework instead of the shadow in the corner of my room. The house phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. I heard Mom answer it in her bedroom down the hall. Hello? A pause. Hello? Who is this? Another pause, longer this time. Then her voice shaking. Stop calling this number. She hung up with such force that I heard the plastic crack. I waited a few moments before going to her room. Who was that? I asked, finding her sitting on the edge of her bed, face pale. She shook her head. Nobody, wrong number. Mom, I pressed. What did they say? She looked up at me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. They didn't say anything at first. Then they whispered something. I couldn't make it out clearly. What did it sound like? She hesitated. Like, we see you all. But it wasn't one voice. It sounded like several voices speaking together. She forced a laugh. Probably just teenagers playing pranks. But we both knew it wasn't. The phone rang again the next night and the night after that, always at exactly midnight. Sometimes there was only breathing on the other end. Sometimes the same whispered message. After the 4th call, Mom unplugged the phone. That same night, I woke at 3 a.m. to find my bedroom filled with shadow people. Not just the usual 3, but dozens standing in every available space, their featureless faces turned toward my bed. Among them, standing closest to me, were the 3 watchers with their glowing eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only lie there as one of them slowly raised a shadowy arm and pointed directly at my face. "We've been waiting," it said in a voice like dry leaves scraping against pavement, "for you to see us truly." I must have fainted because the next thing I knew it was morning, and Mom was shaking me awake, concern etched on her face. "You wouldn't wake up," she said. "I've been trying for 10 minutes. I sat up, my whole body aching, as if I'd run a marathon. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." But as I moved to get out of bed, my foot hit something solid on the floor. Looking down, I saw the journal I'd found, open to a page I hadn't noticed before, filled with the same symbols that had been carved into my closet door and written across the symbols in fresh ink, "Time to go." We left the house a week later. Not because of anything supernatural, Mom, and Trevor didn't believe us when we finally broke down and told them everything, but because of a job offer in Washington State that Mom couldn't refuse. As we packed our belongings, the shadow people watched from every corner, more visible than they had ever been. The three watchers with the glowing eyes stood in the yard day and night, their gaze never leaving the house. On our last night, as the moving truck sat packed in the driveway and we prepared to spend one final night in the empty house with just our essential belongings, Dylan came to my room. "Do you think they'll let us leave?" he asked quietly, sitting on the bare mattress beside me. I'd been wondering the same thing. The journal had suggested they followed Thomas Wilder and his family. Would they follow us too? "I don't know," I admitted. "But we'll be together. Strength in numbers, right?" He nodded, but neither of us believed it would be that simple. That night, I dreamed of the shadow people flowing out of the house like smoke, swirling around our cars as we drove away, following us down the highway like a storm cloud. I woke gasping, certain it had been real, but the dawn light streaming through my window revealed nothing unusual. As we pulled away from the house the next morning, I looked back one last time. The three watchers stood in the yard, their glowing eyes fixed on our departing cars. As we turned the corner and the house disappeared from view, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. "They're gone," I whispered to myself, hoping it was true. For a few months, it seemed like it was. Our new home in Washington was bright and modern, with no crawl spaces, no unexplained shadows, no scratches in the night. I began to sleep again, to laugh, to forget. But then, on a rainy October evening, almost exactly a year after we'd moved into the Montana house, I glanced out my bedroom window and froze. Standing at the edge of our new property, barely visible through the downpour, were three tall, dark figures with glowing yellowish-white eyes. They had followed us after all, and this time they weren't just watching, they were waiting.